If you've seen the other parts, you get bragging rights in the comments. But if you haven't, go watch them right now. I mean, in this case, you kind of have to, because it's literally the second half of season 2. So, like, what are you doing? Oh, and a side note, I'm going to be talking about this next episode for a stupidly long time. So all I'm going to say is timestamps are your friends, and there is zero reason to not use them. Okay, before I start talking about this episode, I would like to add some context since this is the second episode of the Dark Period. Being the first of 3 episodes to be rushed out the door following Kirby vs. Majin Buu, this episode arguably had the biggest impact on the team. The episode's writer, Nervous Nick, had this episode thrusted onto him because they were all like, oh, he's the fighting game guy, and these are fighting game characters. How bad could this possibly be? Well, this bickering led to more than frustrations with understanding the entire lore of BlazBlue and Guilty Gear, but let's not act like I have nothing to address. Going to my video on Death Battle Remasters, I'd like to show this clip.
And I mean ever get touched again, keep Nervous Nick as far away from the matchup as possible. Hell, just kick him out of the building if you have to.
I hope I don't need to explain why you should never do this. And since I brought that video up, I'd also like to mention a few things that I said in a response to a comment that I pinned. No, Ragna was not the only character teased for the matchup. I definitely remember a Next Time on Death Battle where only Ragna was revealed, but I can't find the actual teaser anywhere. On top of that, they actually do show the dragon install. I mean, it's vague, but that's because of sprite limitations. And honestly, the dragon install that I was referring to was Soul's true gear form. And another thing about this episode's production is that the episode had to be re-uploaded 3 months after its release because it featured fan art that went uncredited. Yeah, not the best lifetime an episode has had. Though I do stand that the way Nick wrote some of the content was very unprofessional, but remember that this was well before Death Battle had the research team they have today. This is why, unlike other BlazBlue fans, I'm more than willing to give Death Battle a second chance with the series. They have researchers that are more than able to give the series a new light and interpret some of its higher end feats, as well as address the notorious multiversal BlazBlue arguments. I mean, if f***ing Darkstalkers is able to get a second look in modern Death Battle, I fail to see why BlazBlue shouldn't. Besides, Nick has said, and I roughly paraphrase, BlazBlue is not hard to follow. It was just a lot to take in as an outsider. He said this at the same event that Raiden vs. Excalibur was revealed, and where James Bond vs. John Wick was unofficially revealed. The event was never streamed, so you'll just have to take my word for it, and I'm not trying to say that another BlazBlue episode is guaranteed to happen at some point, though it is somewhere on the table. Maybe they wouldn't be ready for a Ragna episode specifically, or even an episode featuring Jin, Noel, or Terumi, but they could make the next BlazBlue episode either Bang vs. Chip or Potemkin vs. Tager. These episodes aren't very thematic, but not only are these matchups fairly popular, most of the characters involved don't require extensive knowledge of the series' terminologies, so they'd be a nice window to look into how they would approach the BlazBlue world again from a versus standpoint. And if this window somehow manages to reflect the light of a rare blue moon, and that light somehow manages to compel Nick to find this video and go through with watching it, in case I haven't made it clear enough, I hold no ill will towards you or anyone else that worked on this episode, nor anyone involved with this Dark Period, or any of Death Battle's other low points. I'm doing the best amount of research I can for this series' production history, but at the end of the day, I don't know the full story of any episode's production, let alone Ragna vs. Soul, where there's almost nothing public. I would also like to mention that my script for this episode is very different. I like to show the scripts of my videos on Patreon, which you don't know that because for some reason you're not one of my patrons, are you? This script is styled in the same way as the videos on my second channel, where I have a bunch of bullet points of stuff I think I need to say or reference, and then I ad-lib from there. This episode is the one exception. Even with Goku vs. Superman, I scripted the fight animation, but I didn't script the analyses because I didn't think I needed to. Whereas here, I'm scripting and analyzing every fundamental level of this episode as I wanted to write down everything as respectfully as I can. As much as I want to act professional, I'm not gonna sugarcoat a damn thing about this episode. So let's just tear into it, why don't we? So to start off, I think that Wiz's delivery of
Ragna the Bloodhead
is a little weird, but what can you do? He tried to sound cool. But going into Ragna's analysis, they start by talking about the Black Beast and how it took the 6 heroes to take it down, and then they start talking about Ragna. Of course, you have Boomstick saying his edgelord appearances says he has tragic backstory written all over it. But I do like how Wiz calls his backstory gruesome. Anyways, that's all the positives I have to say about Ragna's analysis, so let's just get into the negatives. A general theme of Ragna's analysis is the no one knows running gag. And over the course of this review, I'm going to explain to you why this phrase is not only very insulting to BlazBlue fans, but also fails as a functional joke. The first time they say no one knows actually isn't too bad. The way that Wiz delivers it makes it come across as some sort of mystery. Of course, they never capitalize on it at any other point in the analysis, but it's the least bad. That being said, the context of it is what the experiments were for, which have multiple explanations in the story. They were trying to find a vessel for Yuki Terumi. They were conducting prime field experiments, which is literally experiments on artificial humans, like Ragna. And with Ragna in particular, they noticed that he had traces of the Black Beast within him. And given how the Black Beast is a pretty important part of BlazBlue's lore, I think that Relius and Terumi would be compelled to extensively look into that. The next bit is them saying,
Ragna's sister Saya grew very sick.
With what?
Sickness? No one knows.
You, scientist with an English major, can you read? Then they start to talk about Jin's relationship with Ragna and Saya, and then they use it as a segue to Terumi's role in his backstory.
So then a maniacal hipster villain named Yuki Terumi showed up out of nowhere, helped Jin impale Ragna through the chest, and then cut off his arm for good measure.
Then Wiz, by himself, with nobody asking or leading into it, says,
Why? How? No one knows.
Okay, to start off, while Jin was jealous of—
Have you familiarized yourself with that phrase yet? Good, because it's not stopping anytime soon.
Well, at least he's being honest about not liking BlazBlue very much. Okay, to start off, while Jin was jealous of Ragna's relationship with Saya, that's not why he killed him. There were two other factors at play here. The Nox Nictoris Yukianasa's power of order, it's really not that difficult to say, and Terumi himself. They both convinced Jin to kill Ragna because he was the Black Beast, and they said that Jin was destined to kill him because he was supposed to be the hero. But instead, they ignore all of that and paint Jin as a moron who just randomly tried to kill the only people in his life when that's not at all what's happening. And as for Terumi, it's actually not a big deal at all since he's painted as a cruel, twisted man who's evil for the sake of it, but he needed to rely on Jin to destroy a magic barrier surrounding the church so that he could use Jin's memories and Saya's body for his own research. The next bit is a tiny bit better, where Boomstick points out how Rachel just revives Ragna, gives him a new arm, and leaves. I mean, the phrase, "don't think, just accept," is annoying given Wiz was being passive-aggressive earlier, but it's not that bad. I would have just changed it to Boomstick's delivery of,
What the fuck?
in Eggman vs. Wily. Wiz then skips the part where Jubei helps him to learn about the Azure Grimoire, and talks about both it and the concept of Seether, which they tried to claim that it's different from magic, despite the fact that Seether is literally called magic element in Japan. It was just localized as Seether. So, yes, it is magic. They do come back to Jubei training Ragna, because good pacing isn't as vital as mocking a series, am I right? I say this because Wiz randomly says, again, by himself, with nobody leading into it,
Where the hell was he before? No one knows.
Jubei is one of the 6 heroes. He has all sorts of missions and affairs, searching for some of the NOL's cauldrons, keeping an eye on Terumi, interfering with Relius's research, assisting the other 6 heroes with their affairs. And on top of that, they say it like Jubei was being irresponsible, but he did leave Ragna, Jin, and Saya in the care of his sister-in-law Celica Mercury, because he wanted them to be away from Relius and especially Terumi. No, I will commend Boomstick for trying his best to give Wiz an explanation.
Probably destroying someone's furniture or pissing in their shoes.
You know, this joke would be at least a little bit funny if it wasn't the only joke that Boomstick ever makes about cats. I mean, he made this joke a few times in Felicia vs. Tao Kaka, and I wouldn't say it was peak comedy there. At least they point out that Jubei was the one who gave Ragna his red jacket and his sword.
Called Blood Scythe.
It's actually called Aramasa, but I can tell you're not interested in doing a 5-second Google search, so okay.
And before you point out that it's clearly a sword, not a scythe, it can do this.
Doesn't change the fact that it's still a sword, but 5-second Google searches don't interest Boomstick either, so okay. And then they talk about how Ragna became known as the Grim Reaper and bring up his bounty.
90 billion, whatever their currency is. No one knows.
Guys, it's really not that difficult. Also, I'd like to point out that in the games, they show this poster with the currency's name and symbol, so it's bizarre that they bring this up as a weird moment at all. Hell, you the player can literally earn this currency in the games and spend them on things like alternate colors and artwork. Did you just not play the games while researching them? It certainly wouldn't help Wiz and Boomstick with the ending of Ragna's analysis.
In fact, Ragna was the original Black Beast, sent back in time after falling into a magic cauldron. The two were somehow separated and did battle in the past. These events would repeat themselves in a 100-year time loop until this chick saved Ragna from falling into that cauldron, stopping the Black Beast from appearing in the past in the first place.
But if the Black Beast Beast never went back in time, then it would never have created Seether, and everything in BlazBlue shouldn't exist as we know it. So how?
No one knows!
Okay, there is a lot to unpack here. Is what I would say if the series didn't answer their exact question within 2 words. Multiverse theory. Of course, this doesn't change the fact that a lot of what they said is wrong, but even if they were right, the simple concept of multiverse theory would still debunk this whole no one knows bit. Multiverse theory has been a key part of BlazBlue's story ever since the first game. There are a bunch of moments you could use as examples, but really, the existence of Hakumen is all you need. It shouldn't be too much to understand this question with, maybe it works like how Hakumen works. Also, side note, I don't appreciate Noelle being referred to as this chick. I know that she isn't the most beloved character in BlazBlue, but not only do I like her a lot, but when you remember how she's the main heroine of the game and how imperative she is to Ragna's story as a whole, a name drop would have been nice. However, unlike Wiz and Boomstick, I don't think you're that stupid. I think you're smart enough to pick up on the pattern that I'm pointing out. One reason why no one knows fails as a functional joke is that none of this stuff matters. The first bit is kind of understandable, but it's still not entirely relevant information aside from the Black Beast somehow being inside of Ragna. The second bit you can answer with the manga panels that they're literally showing on screen. The third bit is just a hot mess. It deliberately overlooks context because Wiz is much more interested in letting you know that he does not like this series at all. The fourth bit is a similar case that's also ignoring the fact that the disappearing mentor figure is a very common trope that no one in the history of ever has considered to be a legitimate flaw of any story. Hell, I know for a fact that they praised Trunks for his debut despite his entire existence basically being an asshole, but it's bad when BlazBlue does it despite having multiple explanations for it in the story. Okay, the fifth bit is just pathetic and a waste of time to go over, and the sixth bit, while sounding like they're pointing out a plot hole one time, can be easily explained with 2 words. Now, don't get me wrong, BlazBlue's story gets crazy convoluted, and even very, very weird. Remember Noelle, the character that Wiz and Boomstick struggled to remember the name of? What if I told you that canonically, contrary to her physical appearance, she's 5 years old? This is because she is a clone of Ragna's sister. One of 3, actually, and her Murakuma form barely hides her— Nope, I am not showing that on screen! All you need to know is that in some shots, they just straight up forget to cover it at points, and it's f***ing gross. Or how about Hakumen? He's actually Jin from another timeline, and he doesn't have access to his full power because the gods of the world cannot decide on whether or not they want to acknowledge his existence. Or how about the fact that Yuki Terumi and Hazama are both Terumi, but they're forced to be separate entities despite sharing the same body, but they have to be different people. And so is the character that Hazama is cloned of. Yeah, Hazama is also a clone, but not a clone of Terumi, despite the fact that he's still supposed to be the same body as Terumi. Oh, but here's one of my all-time favorites. You know Blood Edge? No, not Ragna. The guy who Ragna titled himself after and was Jubei's close friend and master? Well, apparently, this Blood Edge guy is actually Ragna himself. Oh, and as far as I know, it's never specified as to whether or not Ragna is a clone of this Blood Edge person. So as far as the game's concerned, Ragna and Jubei just casually forget each other. It's just something that happens. Okay, let's calm down here. I'm getting a little too sarcastic myself, but either way, Wiz and Boomstick could have talked about any of this, but they don't. Instead, they just take some incredibly minute plot points and amp them up as if they were actual criticisms. This is the same idiotic criticism as a modern CinemaSins video or Nostalgia Critic review. And the funny thing is, Death Battle's not supposed to be like this. They're meant to run down a character's backstory, feats, weapons, armor, and skills without bringing their personal bias and opinions into it. Look, it's fine to poke fun at the occasional weird thing or go, "We don't talk about this bad thing from the franchise!" But that doesn't apply when you vent out your personal frustrations by making fun of everything about the character and the series he comes from. And this no one knows bit perfectly explains why. It's a bad look on the script no matter how you slice it. The best case scenario is that Nick just wrote a bad running gag. Sometimes it happens. But some of the worst cases? Well, one of the worst case scenarios is that Nick's being unprofessional and venting his frustrations into the script. Novice writers get rightfully slammed for venting their petty feelings all the time in a fictional story. But the real worst case scenario is that this no one knows bit is alienating people for liking a video game character, and I shouldn't have to explain why that's awful. And this isn't even the only time it appears. But before we get into that, let's go over Soul's analysis. Or more accurately, let's talk about the one thing that everyone remembers from this section, if not the entire episode. The That Man joke is really funny. Unironically, one of the best jokes of the entire show. Even with my experience revisiting revisiting this episode being negative overall, I still laughed out loud at this bit. The Who's on First style of comedy is brilliantly executed with the way that Boomstick is able to escalate Wiz's anger with his questions, combined with Wiz trying to explain it in a way that he'll understand, only for Boomstick to find a loophole in time. Top it off with Ben and Chad's bombastic voice acting, make it feel like they're genuinely frustrated with one another. Granted, that man has a canon name now, but not only was that long after this episode was released, but given how Wiz was mentally incapable of doing any research on BlazBlue one time, a joke like this makes a nicely constructed home out of the episode no matter when you watch it. And thankfully, this is not the only good joke in the episode. I also like the blue robo-penis joke. It's in line with the crazy anime shenanigans that I wish were included in Ragna's analysis more often. Heck, even Boomstick's delivery of
But is he guilty?
was honestly really charming. Especially when Wiz instantly plays off of it by talking more about Soul's backstory and how he was responsible for his girlfriend's death. That's good stuff right there. But aside from that, Soul's analysis is just fine. They cover his character fine, they explain his abilities and weapons fine, and the other jokes are not funny, but they're fine. When the episode came out, I wasn't familiar with Guilty Gear at all, so I just assumed that Soul was just another character with a big sword. But now that I played a lot of the Guilty Gear games, studied up on the lore, and have grown a massive respect to the point where it's my second favorite fighting game series behind BlazBlue itself, there's a lot missing here. Aside from Justice and that man, they don't mention any of the other characters in the series, nor do they go over his relationship with other characters. With one example being, Kai Kisk. They mention Jin without any issue. They couldn't have at least name-dropped Kai to make the matchup have any intriguing comparisons, like almost every other matchup they've done up to this point. This is the debut of a new series in Season 2, where it stars the main character, who the story is based around, and it barely gets more coverage than Dig Dug. Plus the end clip is kinda terrible as it's not even an end clip. Soul Bad Guy's literally just though there is one moment that sticks out and also brings down the analysis for me.
He went back in time and witnessed his past self get murdered, which should have erased him from the present while Marty McFly. But he didn't like that idea very much, so he just didn't.
After BlazBlue, nothing is too bizarre for me anymore.
Shut up, Chad! You're being a virgin! Sorry. I just couldn't resist screaming that out loud. I thought it'd be really funny. Another reason why No One Knows fails as a functional joke is because this thing from Soul Bad Guy's analysis is weirder than everything they've brought up in BlazBlue combined. To be fair, this could have been an ironic moment like, hey, the weirdest thing we found doesn't bother me. And it would work if Wiz and Boomstick did literally anything other than mindlessly mock the BlazBlue series over trivial bullshit. We get it! You grew a hate boner for BlazBlue that you don't want to put away. That doesn't mean you have to show it to the audience every 3 minutes. And yes, I did say 3 minutes, as it does pop out one last time, but we'll get there later. For now, it's time to talk about the death battle. Death battle analyses tend to get overshadowed by the fight itself, understandably so, and with that in mind, I can see what people like about it. The animation is fast and fluid, and the combos are elaborate, it's synced up to good music. I also think that the setup is perfect. Soul's a bounty hunter, and is perfectly in character for Ragna to just be wandering about despite his large bounty, which they also bring up in Ragna's analysis just so it doesn't look weird to outsiders. That being said, I would have liked to get a fully fledged ArcSys styled intro, but at least we get like half of one. They also use recycled voice clips from their fighting games, and unlike with Ryu vs. Scorpion, they don't mash that well. They use Ragna's English voice and Soul's Japanese voice, especially since they have very different audio qualities, but you know what? Implementing Patrick Seitz as Ragna is always morally correct, so I'll ignore it. It starts with the remix of Blood Pain playing in the background, and I think it's a great track to start off with. It matches the tone of the fight and is even kind of fitting given that their appearances are kind of similar. Both characters are looking for a hit. Soul wins the struggle and lands a decent looking loop combo that causes Ragna to instantly activate the Azure Grimoire? Okay, I get what they were going with this. One of Ragna's weaknesses is that he's over-reliant on the Azure, but that's only when he's getting completely bodied, not after taking like one combo. This causes him to get hit by what is apparently Soul's bandit revolver. I only knew this because it plays the voice clip from off-screen, where you can barely hear it over Ragna's dialogue, though I do like how Ragna uses Dead Spike to pin Soul and— Whoa! Okay, that is a terrible use of masking. You can see bits of the background everywhere, and they didn't even try to play around with the colors or even add a drop shadow to make it look less jarring. Still, Ragna activates the blue and charges at Soul in a damage sprite? Okay then. Well, at least the Ragnacopter combo is pretty cool. Then he activates the idea engine and, okay, that is definitely not how the idea engine works. In the analysis, they said that it works like a barrier, but at no point has it been a separate attack. Certainly not one that causes a wall bounce. After that, Soul activates his dragon install with a muffled voice clip and a limp little doink, and then Ragna activates Blood King. Okay, that is definitely not how that works. The entire point of the idea engine was to help Ragna control the blue without most of the drawbacks. This is basically the equivalent of Goku going Super Saiyan 4 against Superman, saying it's his strongest form, getting one punch, and then downgrading to Super Saiyan 2 after like 5 seconds. To be fair, I do like how Ride the Fire plays during this section, and we get some good back and forth combos followed by a great moment where Ragna impales Soul, taunts him, and then gets stabbed by Soul. It's a raw moment that shows that while Soul didn't just no-sell Ragna's attack, he was still able to survive it, and he used his remaining energy to get one surprise attack that actually affects him. No complaints here. Same can't be said for the ending, even ignoring how Ragna can't just become the Black Beast via overusing the Azure Grimoire. It makes more sense than Ragna becoming the Black Beast after taking some damage from Soul. They don't say this at any point in the analysis, so like, why was it framed like this? Actually, I think a bigger question is, why is Howling Moon playing here? That's Valkenhein's theme, guys. Is it because it has a full moon there? Well, that's really stupid. This shot does look pretty alright though. But what's not alright is Soul turning into his true gear form, which is suddenly in silhouettes now, much like the Black Beast, though I did mention how the true gear form has no sprites, and making their own custom sprites just wasn't an option. Time restrictions are big ol' wankers, I tell you what. But Soul does this weak projectile attack that one-shots the Black Beast despite not actually hitting him, and it somehow destroys most of the area, and Soul is back in his base form. Whatever. Decent fight, but it really shits the bed in the ending. And no, I'm not talking about the kill, I'm talking about the outro clip. This outro clip exclusively focuses on Soul jumping down the pillar, finding a stack of paper titled Blaze Blue Story Script, and destroys it. You know what? Hot take of the night, this is worse than the Volume 3 advertisement that falls down at the end of Yang vs. Tifa. Now, don't mistake me as defending it, as I also have some very unkind words for that little blunder. But let's go over what this outro clip means in the grand scheme of things. You have Wiz and Boomstick doing nothing but shitting all over Ragna and BlazBlue as a whole throughout Ragna's entire analysis, not being subtle about how he doesn't want to talk about or say anything good about the series one time. You have some backhanded comments about some of the other characters in the series as well. Then you have them taking yet another stab at BlazBlue in his opponent's analysis. You have Ragna being misrepresented in the fight's choreography. And finally, without even showing his weapon, you have one last jab at the literal entirety of BlazBlue. To me, this episode feels like a goddamn hate piece, with Soul being used as a vessel to reinforce that hate. Ragna losing has nothing to do with it. He didn't stand a chance against Soul, and even now with all the new feats for both series, he still doesn't. It's just that the way he goes out and the lack of appearance in the outro clip is really uncouth. I've been admittedly a little infamous about how open I've been about how out of all the combatants that have been on Death Battle, Ragna has had worse treatment than every fictional character not named Michelangelo. At least with Shadow, they covered his story well and didn't say that being a quote-unquote edgelord was a bad thing. At least with Bowser, he was characterized mostly very well and had a decent analysis. At least with Starscream, they let him have a single moment of using his uniqueness as a character that was used for his advantage. At least with Tifa, they made her look cool in the fight with some well-implemented references. At least with Luigi, they said he could turn his weaknesses into strengths and demonstrated that in the fight. At least with Aang and Edward Elric, the respect threads that replaced their analysis sections were respect threads. At least with Mega Man Volnut, you had Wiz showing some respect to him, despite literally creating an entire meme of pretty much every Battle Royale matchup in existence. And yes, at least with Superman, they tried to hide their bias. And failed, but they tried. And also, this is implying that the likes of Superman and Shadow were never in a good episode that treated them better. You can't say any of that about Ragna. They couldn't go 5 seconds in his analysis without nitpicking the story. His characterization in the fight had some issues. The only unique character bit he was allowed to have was a poorly masked bit from a cutscene from Calamity Trigger, Wiz was showing less respect to Ragna than even Boomstick, who expressed his arbitrary beef with edgelords in this episode, and neither of them even trying to hide that they didn't want to be talking about Ragna or Blaze Blue. How has nobody been talking about this? I guess you could argue that not everyone is familiar with Blaze Blue, but on the one hand, I don't agree that it explains how people couldn't see any disrespect when everyone knows how dirty Starscream and Ed got done in their episodes, even with both of their series being niche or at least less popular than the more mainstream shows of their mediums. But on the other hand, I can understand why people don't cover the full extent of it, as most of the big name Death Battle content creators aren't familiar with either series. I can only count 2 big names who are. Digitai did call out how disingenuous they were being in Ragna's analysis, and Nemesis Bloodright gave them a slap on the wrist for the whole Platinum Dollars thing, but otherwise, he kinda just skimmed over how bad it got and gave the episode a decent score just because the episode had Soul Bad Guy in it. Ignoring the fact that Soul Bad Guy barely even gets to do half the cool stuff he's known to do, and the very few bits of cool stuff he does do is implemented with as bare minimum effort as possible, because I guess we're not allowed to have the winner looking cool either, apparently. Remember when I said that Soul's analysis was about as meaningful as Dig Dug's outside of a few good jokes? Well, they don't make him look that special in the fight either. For a character that they describe as lazy, he sure is giving it his all until the end. Yeah, the combos may look cool and all, and he obviously isn't nearly as misrepresented as Ragna was in this episode, but I feel like his choreography is kinda backwards. I mean, he goes in hard with some lightning fast combos and attacks, goes into Dragon Install with some shorter combos than in his base form, then he goes into his gear form where he shoots a limp fireball that doesn't even look like it hit anything. Not to mention that his attacks are based around extremely powerful strikes, yet his attacks feel kinda weak. Yeah, the animation is really good. Zach Watkins did a great job with this episode, and I'm not gonna try to pretend he didn't. But the sound design and animation don't give any combo finishers the sense of impact they need, and no amount of constant camera shakes will support that. And this leads us into the biggest problem with this whole animation. It's one thing to have a really bad analysis, but with some episodes you can do exactly that and still get a great fight animation out of it. But with Ragna vs. Soul, the fight's biggest issue is that it has no identity. I mean, really think about it. Up until the Black Beast scene, this whole animation is the type of white noise-flavored milky toast you'd see in the vast majority of Season 1's repertoire, or even the majority of Season 4's episodes. Wait, who said that? Can you name any highlight that makes it stand out from the rest of the episodes in this season? Because having revisited all of its episodes, I think that Fulgor vs. Sector unironically has a more memorable fight animation than this. Sure, it's good animation, but can you name any moment that screams Ragna vs. Soul? Better yet, name another highlight you wouldn't be able to see in another episode. Personally, I'm a huge fan of both characters and the series they come from, but I can hardly tell you. Granted, the episode did have the necessary dynamic of the Azure Grimoire versus the Dragon Install, represented by Ragna's black long shadow and Soul Sprite's blinking red. This is fine because of the sprite limitations. While Soul does have a more elaborate design for it in Xrd, not only were those sprites a lot less accessible, but they would absolutely need to spend a long time working on custom sprites, which again was just not an option. But I'm glad that they were able to distinguish them at all. But there is one thing I should say. What if I told you that neither character uses a single one of their supers in the fight? I'm serious. There's no Ragna screaming, "Carnage Scissors!" And there's no Soul Bad Guy going, "Tyrant Rave!" at any point in the fight. And reminder, this is a fighting game themed episode where neither character uses a super, knowing that 7 episodes ago they had the loser using both of his finishers along with the winner using at least one of his supers, 2 if you count his No Mercy in the outro clip. And 3 episodes ago, we had a super as one of the most impactful attacks of the entire season. But if you want to be technical, Blood Cane and Dragon Install do qualify as supers, but they're literally meant to power up their special moves and even give them access to other moves or even supers that they can't access normally in their base forms. You could have done what Ryu vs. Scorpion did, where you had Ryu using his specials in base form, and then once he powers up into a stronger form, that's where the supers come out. But here, it oddly feels like the opposite. They barely even use their special moves. Oh, and side note, Ragna only uses 2 special moves in the entire fight, those being Dead Spike, which is used pretty creatively, even if he forgets to yell out its name for some reason, and Inferno Divider, which he does yell out, but you can barely hear it over the unnecessarily loud sound effects. Soul does have it a little better, but even then, he uses 2 gun flames, a blink and you'll miss it Volcanic Viper, a banded revolver that's off screen for some reason, and Wild Throw. And with exception of the Inferno Divider, they only use these moves in their base forms. And in their super forms, they almost exclusively use generic attacks. This adds a sort of weird reverse power creep to this whole episode. Is that what it's called? Is there like an actual term for it? Like, what would it even be? Like a weaken creep? That's probably not what it's called, but I'm going to be using it anyway because I think it sounds funny. This fight has a weird sense of weaken creep that literally does not exist in any other episode. I mean, for Martel's sake, even the Mistake somehow managed to have a convincing sense of power creep. On top of that, this episode also has no dust combos, no Soul Eater, no bursts, no Blaze Blue signal when Ragna activates the Azure, which by the way, even Taukaka got to use in her episode, and that was during her Astro Heat, which this episode also doesn't have. No pretty visuals, and no Aramasa transforming into a scythe. Didn't Boomstick literally call it a scythe in the analysis? But let's be real. It's unfair and childish of me to expect everything I want in a matchup to be translated perfectly in an episode. Certainly for a season 2 episode that was a victim of time constraints. But if they weren't going to use any of their supers, there is one thing that they definitely should have included at the very bare minimum. A Guilty Gear instant kill. For those who don't know, this is the series' take on a Mortal Kombat fatality. And yes, I am directly implying that this is the equivalent of a Mortal Kombat episode where the Mortal Kombat character wins, but there's no fatality to be seen. With all of this in mind, the episode feels less like a fight between Ragna and Soul and more like a fight between two generic functions with big swords. You could replace this whole episode with a Cloud vs. Guts DBX and nothing would change. Hell, Guts vs. Nightmare has the same exact beats as this episode. And on another note, why is this still the only Guilty Gear episode of the entire show? Hell, Guilty Gear hasn't even had a character in DBX or 1 Minute Melee. I mean, we've seen Blaze Blue in both shows a few times. Where's my Guilty Gear love in Versus? And I guarantee I'm gonna get some comments from people who only ever watch mainstream IPs owned by Disney or Nickelodeon and say,
"Well, you see here, Guilty Gear is a new series that Death Battle has no reason to bring back."
Because as we all know, Death Battle has never made episodes starring niche characters or series, nor has Guilty Gear ever had a new game that has sold millions of copies, been renowned as one of the most beloved modern fighting games in mainstream media from casuals and critics, reached trending status on social media platforms multiple times, sustained a strong player base with its even higher acclaimed DLC and rollback netcode, and maintained a huge cult following by the nature of the series with its ambitious storytelling. Yeah, I agree, that's completely unrealistic. Okay, you might think that I'm stretching as far as I can reach with how many gripes I brought up. And yeah, a lot of them are personal, and they definitely bother me more than they would bother the average Death Battle fan. At best, it's about as memorable as an old tree that I passed by when driving on the highway, and at worst, it's an episode that randomly feels like alienating me over liking a fictional character. So with that in mind, what else am I supposed to gain from this episode? I have no issue with saying that, aside from the mistake, this is my least favorite episode of the entire show. I'm aware that it is not the worst. There are a minimum of 6 other episodes outside of season 1 that I would consider worse on a technical level. 3 of those being in this very season, and one of those was already talked about. But I hate this episode more than any of them. It mocks me for liking a fictional character, condescends me for liking a video game series, upsets me when I hear the two hosts acting biased and unprofessional because logic, reasoning, and lack thereof, and above all disappoints me that they don't even make the other character look cool at all, because they're more interested in using him as a tool to further dunk on the character they're already expressing constant distaste for. All of this for what? An animation that gets heavily outclassed by virtually every other good episode in the series? Be real! I would infinitely prefer an episode that feels like an advertisement meant to hype up a character I don't like, who's from a series I like even less, at the expense of a character I do like, rather than an episode that feels like a hate piece on one of my favorite series and one of my favorite characters that doesn't even try to make the winner looking cool either, despite also being one of my favorite series. Oh look! There's Tyrant Rave! With fire attack trails? Gee, glad to know that they were always on the table, but you consciously chose to reserve them as a means of gifting Blaze Blue fans with an ugly bird. You too, I guess. Look, I got no beef with the people who worked on this episode. They clearly learned and improved from this misstep. But at the same time, if they're not gonna hide their bias in an episode that's not supposed to be filled with their own personal opinions, then I should not have to hide my bias when talking about your video in another video where my personal opinion is half the point. So I'm gonna let my bias fully determine the score and give Ragna vs. Soul a well-deserved 21 out of 100. The only factors that help it maintain a score above a 20 are the That Man joke and the fact that I get to hear Patrick Seitz as Ragna again, even if it's through recycled voice clips. But other than that, this episode and virtually everything to do with it. Ragna vs. Velvet when? Jeez, now I'm gonna get a bunch of comments calling me a child. Rightfully so, as just in case I need to point this out, you don't have to share the exact opinions that I have on this episode. I don't expect anyone's opinion to change just because some nobody on the internet talked about it one time. I would like you to understand my opinion and where I'm coming from with it, but you don't have to parrot my exact words to everyone you see. Oh, and also, do not harass anyone who worked on this episode, or anyone who doesn't think that Ragna was done that dirty. I mean, look, I'm the one publicly crying about this episode on the internet, and I don't do that, so I fail to see why you should. Okay, you know you got me all f***ed up when I'm actually happy to be talking about an episode like Gaara versus Toph. Your house clearly needs a new sink, so why not let it enter for a bit? While Goku versus Superman was the first controversial episode of Death Battle, at least you had people saying, actually Superman does win, they were right. But with Gaara versus Toph, I don't think there was a single person in the history of ever that unironically tried to defend this episode, barring the people who would just parrot Death Battle's words verbatim. In fact, with one exception, it's probably the most controversial episode of this season. And being the third episode of the Dark Period, it being rushed out the door did not help its reputation at all. And it's off to a good start with Boomstick saying Gaara of the desert really fast, and Wiz delivering Toph Bei Fong, the blind bandit, with actual pacing. If nothing else, I did enjoy these character rundowns. Speaking as someone who doesn't care about Naruto or Avatar, Gaara's story was actually really fascinating to learn about, and so was Toph's. There were also some alright jokes, such as Boomstick saying he looks like a member of Green Day, though I didn't quite care for when they called him an emo kid, but it's followed up by Boomstick saying he won't give him too much crap, so it's fine. Though Gaara's end clip is so weird, all he's doing is just strolling down some stairs with not a lot happening. I did enjoy Toph's analysis more though. The Badger Mole's part of the analysis had some well-delivered jokes, like how the hell would they know, and LASIK surgery. And Wiz saying don't make any innuendos, she's 12. It's kinda weird since Boomstick was showing distaste to her before and after, but I like how he knew Boomstick would try to make a pun anyway. That's fair. And Toph does have a better end clip than Gaara. But like with all these other controversial episodes, despite how much enjoyment I get from the rundowns, the fight has plenty of issues. Though the voice acting is not one of them. Marissa Lenti, who was Noin's VA from Tiger Zord vs. Epion, was able to quickly cast Chris Guerrero and Rina-chan for their roles respectively. And personally, I think they both do a great job. Chris's voice as Gaara is very soothing to listen to, and Rina-chan's Toph, from what I know, captures the character really well. I did find some of their dialogue clunky at first, but it gets better and I still like their interactions, with this one being my favorite.
It'll take a lot more sand than that to take me down.
That's the plan.
Much like how I planned to say that the rest of this fight is not particularly great. Much like this ad-lib after realizing how it sounds when I say it out loud. I think the biggest issue with this fight is the way that the sand looks. I mean, it really is just a ball of pixels, which I guess it's fine, but some of the sand effects just flat out get cut off and it comes across as really distracting. Plus, in terms of choreography, it is so unbelievably boring, with the absolute defense bit being the worst case of it. Seriously, at some points it genuinely feels like this episode has no pacing. And overall, despite the fact that their powers could theoretically play off of each other, they really don't do that. Outside of this one moment where Gaara's sand changes color, to illustrate that Toph is redirecting it. Okay, that was cool, but why is that the only unique interaction in the entire fight? And of course, the death sucks. Apparently, Toph is supposed to be using sand bending to compress Gaara's sand armor down into his body and crushing him with it, but not only does most of it happen off-screen, likely because of the time constraints this episode had, but when we cut back to Toph, Gaara's sprite looks almost the exact same, but less saturation, I guess. Also, why is there no outro clip? But let's be real, for the most part, none of this is why people hate the episode so much. They hate it because of the conclusion. All they say is that Toph is able to see and redirect Gaara's sand. To play devil's advocate, I could see this being a genuine advantage that Toph can have, despite her weakness to sand. Although it's weird how they never bring it up until the conclusion, but still, at least it's something she has. But then it still begs the question, what happens when Gaara dumps a village-sized sand pile on her? And on top of that, they actually gave Gaara some stats for speed, but Toph got nothing for speed? That's definitely a failure on the episode's part. Oh, and there's this infamous bit where they say, yeah, Gaara's sand is... Fuck. Making me cough, that's what it's doing. Yeah, Gaara's sand is powerful, but it's still sand. Okay, yeah, it's just sand. Sand that's able to casually break boulders and completely no-cell building-sized metal just by hardening itself a little bit. I'm pretty sure regular sand can't do that, you know. We can argue the validity of this conclusion all we want, but at the end of the day, this episode sucks. 30 out of 100. Overall, it's a great improvement over Ragna vs. Soul. Nice work, Death Battle! Dailies and Mental Gin, we have come to the final episode of the Dark Period, and the first episode that not only put returning combatants on the table, but rematches too. So I think you can imagine what fans demanded the next rematch should be. And I like how the episode begins with a tribute to Monty And yeah, I like to rag on Ruby because I genuinely dislike it, but at the end of the day, I can't deny that Monty has had a ton of impact on Death Battle, with Torian Crawford in particular taking a lot of inspiration from his animation style. So it feels thematic that he's the animator of this episode, which in itself is a tribute to Montyum's arguably most iconic single work of animation, Haloid, which I actually do remember watching back in the day. It really is another icon of its time. Throughout the episode, I could tell that there was a lot of love and passion, even in its weaker times. I noticed this in their rundowns where they not only brought back the jokes from the first Boba Fett vs. Samus episode, but also expanded on them to make them funnier. Sometimes it works.
Alien bird DNA.
Well then, F that planet and its birds.
And sometimes it doesn't.
There, EE. Daddy's here. Killing time soon.
And there are also some new jokes as well, such as the fake-out transition, and they also included some other M story slander, and yet they still show the game in her end clip. Okay. Now on to the fight. Two things. One, remember when I talked about Chief vs. Doomguy benefiting from a 3D episode? This episode is exactly why I say that. We get some cool dynamic angles as well as strategies that just couldn't be done on a Sprite episode. At least one on a 2D plane. And for two, yeah, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, this fight is very, very flawed. This kick from Samus looks really jank, and Fett's bomb strategy was cool, but it leads to a rather awkward Zero Suit Samus transformation. In fact, from here on out, I could tell that a lot of it just felt rushed. My sister in Christ, you did not just kick a lightsaber with a metal boot, what? And they also have the Paralyzer Whip working like a lightsaber. Oh, okay, I'll admit, this is kinda cool, but once we snap back to reality, oh, there goes gravity. And also, how is her pistol able to shoot ice shots? I like how the kill calls back to the original, but I can't really bring my suspension of disbelief to believe that this could happen. It's not a bad fight, just one that feels very rushed and not one that has a lot of time to flesh itself out. And the conclusion is mostly fine, but it's weird how they use Samus making people think she's a man as a means of getting around Fett's crafty strategies. Like, what? How does that work? But what follows is a unique credit sequence that is yet another homage to Monty. It's kinda corny, but in the same sort of early 2010s kinda way. I like the quote that they end with here. Growth is awkward. In retrospect, kind of embarrassing. Hardly appreciating how important they were, but in the end, ultimately necessary. I wouldn't be surprised if the Death Battle team were still holding on to this quote to this day. And I think that fully justifies this score of mine, a 65 out of 100. I really wish it was higher, but sadly it's not their fault. But then again, this is just further proof that growth is in fact awkward. But hey, if you decide to let your growth shine through, you can create something really special that gets you out of that rut. And that's exactly what this next episode is. Fitting how this was the episode that finally got Death Battle out of the Dark Period. He secretly wanted to find an opponent for Chuck Norris for years, but he had many doubts about doing so. But then a brilliant idea came, and this idea was 7HTEVSKPHPXYOTJN_DHLDYTFTS0YZLR7RHGU_VH. Oh, sorry, none of y'all speak broken link. This created grounds for a perfect joke episode. Is what I would say if it weren't for one simple factor. The Chuck Norris memes. Chuck Norris memes definitely had their time and place. In fact, they were already outdated by the time this episode aired, so it had to come down to how the analysis would execute them. And on the one hand, Chuck's analysis wasn't as fun as I wanted it to be, but on the other hand, the Chuck Norris memes fit in quite naturally. They make this work by balancing between analyzing him as a real combatant and making memes out of him, eventually diving into the Chuck Norris fact book. It's definitely an analysis that was more fun back then, but given that Chuck Norris memes were already outdated back then, I'm happy to say that this analysis still holds up. That being said, I honestly preferred Segata's analysis. The part where they prove that Segata was still alive is epic. The Rent-A-Hero game to both of his Sonic bits, game and comic. Also, this implies that Segata is weaker than DC Heralds and by extension Chuck Norris is too. And oh hey, Death Battle just predicted stan culture.
Yes, he is somehow dating a video game character.
But let's not worry about that, because we got a fight to take a look at. And it starts with Chuck flipping through channels to avoid seeing Segata's ads, but then Chuck thinks that the TV can tell what he's thinking, and BAM! Segata pops out of the TV. And then he just crushes the whole Sega Saturn on his back with just his hand. Although it's framed like he's moving it out of the way, but who cares? It doesn't matter. I just like the part where Segata is blocking all of Chuck Norris's machine gun bullets by just... And then Chuck gets to throw out some punches with an admittedly poorly sound-balanced line, but then we get to see the third fist and... Oh my Lanta, I love that bell sound. And then Segata starts to clone himself, and it's a pretty fun scene. Although the giant Segata does look a little off because I got the impression that he's supposed to be giant. But I don't know, sometimes it feels like his size is inconsistent. At first towering over Chuck, but then Chuck gets on his back and he looks smaller. At least that's what I see anyways. But then Segata is just shrunken down to his normal size by the time he gets on the moon, I think? Is that what happened? I don't know. But it gets saved by everything else that happens in this fight. Segata spins Saturn's ring so rapidly and yeets it at Chuck Norris, crashing through every other planet until it dissolves in the sun. An asteroid moped, that is peak comedy. And then the sun just flat out explodes by virtue of Chuck moving forward a bit. And they both put on the deal with it shades because this is just something that they deal with on the regular. And then Chuck finally uses a roundhouse kick, which causes a giant black hole to appear, destroying the universe. And apparently it also affects Death Battle itself, because the distortion shows the Pokemon Battle Royale, Ryu vs. Scorpion, Batman vs. Captain America, that episode, if you know, you know, and Superman vs. Goku. Wait, what? Oh. Okay. Ooh, that is a pretty constellation, though. Is this where the fight keeps going?
Apocalyptic!
Fair enough. I also love it when this constellation is referenced in other episodes. You could say that the conclusion is a cop-out, but personally, I don't really mind. I mean, they literally say death itself fears Chuck, so, yeah. I'm pretty sure a death would just be impossible. The one last thing I want to say about this episode is the power creep. It's done incredibly well. It starts off at wall level via Segata crashing through a wall. Then it goes to mountain level via Segata's judo throw exploding Chuck, with the second explosion blowing up the mountain. Then we get to small planet via moving the Earth. I think that's dwarf star level now that I think about it, but I know that dwarf star level also applies to Saturn's rings, and then to solar system level with the sun blowing up the solar system, and then to universal, because they say Chuck's roundhouse kick is as strong as the Big Bang. And then I'd assume that by the end of this episode in 3069 or something, we'd get to see boundless level destruction that actually destroys reality as we know it. But until then, I think this episode deserves a great score. 85 out of 100. With the only issue I have with it is that Chuck's analysis wasn't as funny as I remember, and I kind of wish the fight had more dialogue. None of those are deal breakers, they just would have been nice. Starting with Guts vs. Nightmare, this was where Death Battle finally started using a consistent schedule, with episodes being released 3 weeks apart. And also with a 20-second advertisement that plays before even the Screw Attack logo. This is more like modern Death Battle than I thought. I'm sure a lot of people were happy to see Guts on Death Battle, but I feel like the only reason he's a part of this matchup specifically is because Chad said he wanted Guts on Death Battle for years, and Ben was like, hey, I like Nightmare. Yeah, that's pretty much how I interpret this. I mean, they say that this matchup in particular has been something that they've always wanted to do, but something tells me that they were more interested in having Guts on Death Battle and just kind of drew his opponent out of a hat. Because, I mean, the connections are just like, they have big swords and they've taken down multiple armies and, something about demons, I guess. Though to be fair, I did like both of their rundowns. I haven't read Berserk, but I am aware that it is one of the most influential series to come out of Japan. And the fact that Boomstick is too intimidated to go into the full extent of his backstory, yet has no problem saying that when Miss Marvel is unconscious. Another thing I liked is how they talked about the 7-foot-tall sword. That was a cool fact. And the Berserker armor I thought was run down pretty well. And I've always really liked Guts' end clip, but I can't really explain why. It's just always been one of my favorite end clips, I guess. But unlike with Guts, I am very familiar with Soul Calibur. So with Nightmare's analysis, I was pretty intrigued by how they would go about it. And it was mainly based around Soul Edge, which is fine because, in a way, Nightmare pretty much is Soul Edge.
Gigantic, powerful, sexy.
Wait, you really find that hot? Also, I guess there's just gonna be a running thing of not willing to name drop good female characters in fighting games? Okay. To be fair, there are other bits to enjoy, like the flyer is when one achieves the power of flying. It's joke. Saying that out loud really hurts my brain, but I am perfectly okay with it. But either way, it got me enthused, it got a decent joke, and then Nightmare's analysis just ends. Okay. Now on to the fight, and I guess I should immediately address what I mentioned earlier, how Ragna vs. Soul is basically the same animation. Hear me out. Both start off with sword clashes and a fight sequence where they seem evenly matched until the winner of the episode gets an opening and does a quick combo that knocks them back. Then the loser tries to unleash their power before getting bopped, but they find a chance to use it and turn the tides for a moment that knocks the winner back with one powerful blast. Then they both change into their stronger forms. Guts only has one form, but the arm cannon thing has the same amount of impact as the dragon install, and that's very sad. But the loser transforms immediately after the winner does. But the winner is able to get one devastating blow that forces the loser to show their true form. And then the winner goes into their final form, one-shots with a limp attack that has no impact, and then the fight just ends. Oh, and also this fire is literally the exact same one used in Ragna vs. Soul. And you thought I wouldn't notice it. However, I do consider this a much better episode than Ragna vs. Soul for one simple reason. Well, I mean, two, and one of the reasons should be very obvious. But unlike Ragna vs. Soul, this episode has a distinct identity. These sword swings look really heavy and powerful. I like these lightning and explosion effects, even though it's kind of weird that they don't destroy the whole forest given the size of this explosion, but The Night Terror transformation is really good, and this shot of Guts jumping through the fire, cleaving his arm off, and then slamming his sword into Nightmare's head, those were all incredibly raw moments. But my favorite part about this entire animation is the music. The Soul Calibur soundtrack really elevates so many moments of this animation, with the best one in my opinion being Night Terror's transformation. Plus, you actually have Nightmare getting to use his moves on screen, and it has a decent vibe to it that not many other episodes share. But that doesn't mean this animation is devoid of problems. I mean, Guts' first appearance in this episode is like 5 frames per second. The sprites move fluidly the rest of the time, but this moment is a little odd. And the arm cannon moment is just really weird. They tried to make it this surprise moment where they hide Guts' arm behind Soul Edge, and Nightmare is able to cut Guts' cheek, but then his arm cannon opens very slowly, and Nightmare doesn't try to move out of the way despite having more than enough time to do so. And much like with Ragna vs. Soul, the ending sucks. Oh, hi, Cinder. Guts transforms into Berserker armor, farts out a little sword swing, and then destroys Soul Edge, I guess. Oh, and it's got a way, way worse conclusion. At least with Ragna vs. Soul, the conclusion was consistent with the stats they gave. But here you have nothing Guts somehow being able to beat Nightmare, who they literally say is able to destroy a castle with one swing of his sword. Heck, with the clip they show, he's technically not even swinging the sword, just plummeting it into the ground. I mean, yeah, they do say that Guts fights stronger opponents all the time, but Nightmare kills people weaker than him all the time, so what are you trying to play at? You even say that Nightmare has more power than him. And also you say that Dragon Slayer can destroy Soul Edge since it exists on an astral plane, but could Soul Edge destroy Dragon Slayer? It's a much tougher sword, so why would you want to ignore that? Yeah, this is not a very good episode, but I think it had some moments that prevent me from calling it bad. Nevertheless, a 55 out of 100 is not a score to be bragging about. Guts versus Claire, Dimitri win, and much like with Guilty Gear, what's stopping you from including one more new Soul Calibur matchup aside from absolutely nothing? It doesn't even have to involve Nightmare specifically, just do one of these. Not gonna kill you. Here we go, buddy. Now we're really getting into the fan favorites of the show. Scheduling conflicts also impacted this one, with Nick writing most of the episode himself, but Ben had to write the battle script. And this was around the time where Torian was just moving into Screw Attack's office. And while Ben thinks these analyses go on for too long, I think they're engaging enough. Like, I love the Arno Stark fake out at the beginning of Tony's analysis, coupled with the music giving it an excellent sense of gravitas. And it fleshes out Tony really well, going over his feats, his flaws, his redeeming qualities. And Lex's analysis is better. Minus the one stroke with Power Girl joke. That's pretty cringe, not gonna lie, Wiz. But they flesh out Lex a lot better than Tony, which is saying something. They portray him as a man of the people type of villain. And I think this nuances Lex Luthor as an amazing villain, which he is. And there's also the 40 cakes bit, which, side note, is also the thumbnail that my editing software decided to go for this video. Absolutely based. They read the quote in its entirety, and then they end up being genuinely upset that it was confirmed to be canon. That's perfect. But these are some great analyses. But what about the fight? Is it just as good? Well, I would like to point out of all the scripts he's worked on, Ben considers this the best of them all. So I think this fight is one hell of a treat. You see this map? It was made via a mocap rig made from a few Xbox 360 Kinects, and Tony's face being made with actual facial motion capture. And that makes a lot of sense, because for the most part, I think that to this day, this animation looks stellar. These suits look nice and vibrant to where they aren't oversaturated in colors or anything, but they don't look dull like most other 3D models of the time. There are some moments where Lex's suit isn't always in perfect lighting, but other than that, this animation holds up astoundingly well. Not to mention that both characters are coupled by two of my favorite voice performances in the entire series. Chuck Huber as Tony captures all the aspects that we love about Tony Stark in the MCU, as well as the comics, and even puts a bit of his own unique spin on the character to where you can recognize it as a specific kind of Iron Man, rather than somebody doing an impression of another Iron Man. And of course, you have the GOAT Johnny Matrigano as Lex Luthor. He's amazing here, and skipping ahead a bit, he's amazing when he got to return about 6 years later. Glad to know he still got it, but let's get back to the better episode. I just kind of spoiled it. I did not mean to do that. This setup is a classic hero versus villain scenario that justifies why Lex would attack Tony, but still has Tony being the aggressor. What the? That was a voice clip from Iron Fist in Ultimate NPC 3. But the start of this fight, despite being the least interesting area visually, well, aside from the cameos from Gundam and the Batmobile, where Lex recognizes the Batmobile for a moment before destroying it, and then Tony being shocked as to how much the expenses would be. I love that. But then they decide to take this outside, and this is where the fight starts to get really good. Lex destroys Tony's base suit, has a good smashing line that captures the campiness of Lex while still making him come across as charismatic, and then Tony gets a good response as he activates the Hulkbuster armor, where this is admittedly the least impressive looking suit, but it still looks alright. It even includes a reference to Age of Ultron. Then Lex puts his force field back up, and Tony is trying everything he can to destroy it, and he eventually does it with a line from Lex that admittedly feels slapped on because they forgot to add lip syncing to it. Oops. But the moment he gets another chance, oh no, he's powered down. And this gives Lex plenty of time to kill him with this satellite beam. I do think this line read is a little weird because instead of being someone who's all charismatic, he suddenly goes into, "Let me tell you something, Stark." I mean, it's not bad. I just think it's a little jarring given the performance he's been playing up to this point and what he continues to play after this. Although, now we're on to the amazing bit. This line read from Chuck Huber, the ever so iconic, "I've been playing human." What if I told you that this was actually a reference to a Marvel comic, where Tony was apparently the villain in that scenario? So by default, this is the best utilization of a reference that Death Battle has ever done. And there's a good reason for that, because you might have not noticed this, but Tony has been the underdog of this fight the entire time. Not to a point where he gets bodied or is treated like a jobber, but to a point where it's clear that he's using at least more than one suit against Lex's one suit, who would often just tank Tony's attacks via standing here in his force field. And this happens twice. And when you remember the hero versus villain setup that's been established throughout the entire episode, this really feels like an incredible comeback moment that I just can't put it into words. The Ald Noah Zero music, the animation, the way that Tony proceeds to just curb stomp him, and even the implementation of this exchange.
I'll take this. What did you take? Everything.
And the way that Tony just obliterates Lex with a massive unibeam that fully vaporizes him. And then after all that, it follows with Pepper calling him about all the expenses pulled from their account, which Tony tries to ignore. What a great ending. Followed by an outro clip where he pulls out the proton cannon to destroy what's left of Lex's suit.
Bullseye!
Hey, that's the exact same line they used in the outro clip for Ragna vs. Soul. I'm docking point for that! And the conclusion, I'm aware that a lot of time has passed to where people are genuinely interested to see if this fight still holds up. I guess you guys can debate that in the comments if you want to. But personally, I'm just in awe as to how thematic this conclusion is. I don't think it's quite as thematic as in Goku vs. Superman 1, but I do think it beats out Terminator vs. RoboCop in terms of a conclusion that has a thematic edge to it. Pointing out how Lex's suit was based around killing one person, and yet it still failed, but they literally say Tony was naturally prepared for anything. On top of Tony enjoying combat while Lex considering it to be completely beneath him. Proving that while Tony is a cocky bastard who suffers from alcoholism, when the time comes to pull his weight, he's willing to do so. Meanwhile, with Lex, he is so obsessed with trying to kill one person that it ends up becoming his downfall. And if I'm correct, that's kind of the point as to why he keeps losing his fights. Because of his stubbornness and impulsive obsessions. So with that in mind, I don't think it's controversial to say that this is my favorite episode of Season 2. A 97 out of 100, if you will. Ben was right to say that this was the best thing he's ever written. I could not agree with Ben more. And yet it has less views than Batman vs. Captain America 1! Okay, before we get into Beast vs. Goliath, I want you to pay attention to the words used from the next time of this episode. Beast by nature, defenders of humanity, shunned by society. Just keep these words in mind as you pay attention to their analyses. For Beast, they point out his love of poetry and how he quickly got his doctorate. They determine that despite how powerful of a fighter he can be, he mostly relies on his intelligent mind. And with Goliath, a lot of it is about the backstory of the gargoyles and the whole jalapeno thing, which goes on for too long, by the way. I mean, I guess Beast's analysis also had some issues with overusing clips, but whatever. They also point out how he loves to spend his time reading. Despite any flaws these analyses have, they nuance both characters. All of this could easily lead to an interesting animation. So tell me why literally none of that is prevalent at all in the fight? They both fight like mindless beasts, which is something that should be happening around the end of the fight, not throughout the whole thing. There's absolutely no smart decisions made at any point in this fight. I mean, for f***'s sake, you could have at least had Beast reading a book while waiting for night to fall. There's only one line of dialogue, and it's this horribly sound-balanced I guess there's also Beast screaming, "Come on!" for no reason, but why are these the only dialogue exchanges? Was there really no chance to hire voice actors for these two characters? With all of this in mind, it's an episode that feels like White Noise that features a matchup that would almost be the polar opposite of White Noise, or at least would be way more endearing than that. But you know what? I could forgive all of this if it weren't for one simple thing. Beast does most of the damage, while Goliath only gets one hit at the beginning that does nothing, and then he gets one lucky hit at the ending, and then he just wins. This is the worst genre of death battle animations this side of spite matchups. And Ragna, not to mention there's this scene of Beast throwing a car and it looks terrible. His legs are spread out weirdly and it creates an illusion that his calf is attached to his leg, which is an odd thing to say because calves are always attached to legs, but it looks like it could just fall off completely after one good hit on his knee or something. Plus it hardly even looks like he throws the car because there's only one frame where it looks like he's throwing it, but it's in the corner of the screen for some fucking reason. And the death is pretty good, I guess, except for the screen shake not accounting for the aspect ratio, which in hindsight Fox vs. Bucky also had this issue, but it didn't bother me nearly as much because the death was actually good. And the outro clip is just confusing. Why does Goliath steal Beast's head? Oh, and the conclusion...
Beast did not actually lift the whole 60+ ton tree off the ground.
In fact, let's take a look at this real quick. This circle here is implying one of two things. Either someone else was helping him out, or that there's a part of the tree he didn't actually lift. If it's the former, not only does it still look like Beast is doing most of the work, but if we say that he only lifted half of it, wouldn't 30 tons still be more impressive than anything they gave Goliath? But if it's the latter, that's a very arbitrary part of the tree, so why would that one part matter? Also, I feel like Beast could recognize the stone by day rule. You didn't need to add that in. This episode sucks, and I really wish it didn't. Such wasted potential. 34 out of 100. I would like to see this episode get a rematch to where they actually represent the characters properly, but it's probably never gonna happen. This is the other fan favorite of the season, and I'm just gonna give the score right away. 95 out of 100. Nemesis Bloodreich and Biffweed already dissected this episode in its entirety, and I don't really have that much to add. I mean, I'm still gonna talk about it, as there is stuff that I do like that I don't think they fully touched on. Snake's analysis was great. Hearing about his story was interesting, and seeing them cover Otacon was welcomed. I also liked the lighter and hairspray bit, and the microwave feat always impressed me with how it's presented, and it still does. And thankfully, Sam has a great analysis as well. It has some good jokes like, "What is with you today?" and the random tangent about the trip where Boomstick couldn't get a churro.
Bet it was delicious. Oh, shut up, Boomstick. I'll kill you.
But hearing about Sam's backstory felt more interesting to me than I remember. Just the way that they cover Sam's retirement, making you think he lives happily ever after, then pointing out his wife dying, but then saying that he lives a happy life with his daughter, only to end up laughing. But despite how hard they're laughing, it doesn't come across as insulting at all. And I also like how they covered Sam's relationship with Grimm, talking about a solid dynamic between the two and their partnership, which they didn't exactly do for Snake and Otacon. And also Boomstick is once again horny over weapons. Cool. But anyways, now it's time for a stealth battle. Heh. And the opening shot looks amazing, but ooh, that pink sky does not look amazing, sorry. But yeah, the setup, still one of the best in the show, and certainly better than the one for Tony versus Lex. This is what I like about Season 2 episodes, at least the really good ones, where they go out of their way to make the animation more of a story, rather than just a fight. You know, it's one thing to have the whole, "Hey, you cut me off, asshat! Let's kill each other in this pocket dimension that we've never really had in any of our universes." Okay, I guess they also created a pocket dimension for this one, but it's one where they seem to know each other. They would do this a lot for Marvel vs. DC episodes, even today, but I think it's done the best here and a couple of other episodes in Season 9, but we'll get there one day. And then the fight starts and... yes, this is still as funny as I remember. And then there's the box bit, which is just completely brilliant and still kind of catches me off guard. And the banter between Snake and Otacon / Sam and Grimm is great. But my favorite part of the animation is Otacon hacking Grimm's station. I didn't used to think too much of it, but following this recent rewatch, I get it now. It's a lot more intimidating than I remember with how he speaks before he starts actually hacking. And that's the same with the "you're pretty good" delivery. Delivered both as a means of Snake admitting respect for Sam, but also acknowledging that he could be better. I finally noticed that after all these years. And of course the knife fight, what else is there to say? Aside from the fact that I don't love it as much as, say, Biffweed does, but it's still an outstanding finish to an episode like this. With Divine Identity being a fantastic music choice for this moment, there's a reason why this is the only track that's been playing throughout this section, and the kill is the best kill for what it's able to do, with Snake stealing the data and lighting a cigarette as he walks away, saying "piece of cake" as a callback to the beginning. And then the outro clip is Grimm's plane exploding into the base and Snake escaping via helicopter. I don't know why that made me laugh. And for once, superior training earned somebody the victory. You love to see it. It only made sense because these guys were essentially peak human level, but it's a breath of fresh air knowing that superior training has always been considered a weakness in other episodes. They cover other points and they all work, but this is the one that stuck out to me. And yeah, you might notice that I gave it a slightly lower score than episodes like Deadpool vs. Deathstroke and Tony vs. Lex. That's just because I'm a little burnt out by this episode getting talked about in the exact same way, plus I just prefer those two episodes overall. But make no mistake, it deserves to be on the same league as those two episodes. Is this gonna be a regular thing where we go from a banger to a terrible episode to a banger to a terrible episode, on and on and on and on? I feel like we're getting into a terrible episode here. I mean, I guess the analyses weren't that bad. I mean, Vader's was okay. This was peak Star Wars fan jargon. Anakin's a bitch because prequels. Vader's a badass because it's peak fiction, despite the fact that Star Wars was never peak fiction at any point in the history of ever. Vader's analysis suffered from the same issue as Goliath's, where it kept being broken up by Vader quotes, and it did not flow well with the analysis at all. There was also one moment where they play a clip of Palpatine saying that he shall be known as Darth Vader, and then Wiz says,
He was rebuilt as the black-cloaked Lord of the Sith, Darth Vader.
Wiz, I have ears too, bruv. At least Doom's analysis is noticeably better. His background starts off with all sorts of fun references to the comics, in a similar vein to Lex stealing 40 cakes, and Boomstick's poultry science bit is a classic. And even though this gets brought up multiple times, I do think this is the best use of it, since it also has the delivery of being a subvert expectations type of joke, which they did a lot less back then than they do now. So yeah, I still like this joke. They also cover Doom's motivations, which were interesting to learn about, honestly making me like him even more, and he's already one of the best Marvel villains of all time. And while it does also use clips at random points in the analysis, to me it's nowhere near as bad or distracting. And then the fight starts, and Vader's completely dark sprite being used in a dark background is not something you want. Though to be fair, his red lightsaber does help the viewer keep track of where he is. I don't mind Doom's sprite. I mean, the MVC sprites really are the best ones to use, but it does have a couple of janky bits. Like this one, where Doom zooms towards Vader in an admittedly impressive flying shot. That looks cool, but then it randomly cuts to the same shot but on the old 2D plane that's less dynamic, and it really hurts the pacing. And then Vader seemingly destroys Doom, but as it's revealed, it was just a Doom bot. And this is where we start to see some really cool shots and even some creative exchanges of abilities. Honestly, even the fight against the Doombot has some cool moments. Namely, the part where Vader's just able to casually notice his invisibility and start throwing him around like a ragdoll. That was pretty awesome. However, once we travel back in time to the first Thanksgiving to take turkeys off the menu, things get a little weird. Doom just chucking Vader at the dinosaur and killing it with this goofy... this goofy little spin animation, what? But... why does Vader's lightsaber not come back until after Doom throws him into the volcano? Why do they try to make this moment of Doom shooting a rocket Vader like some epic maneuver or strategy when he's the only character that can fly? And why does Doom fly towards Vader only for Vader to just die in the lava? What was Doom planning on doing? And then the outro clip is just Doom's back at Latveria with all the stormtroopers and Vader just shouts, "No!" in yellow text while he's drowning in lava. Weird. And the conclusion, I mean, it's good, but what's interesting is that Doom's rundown has his best quantifiable strength feat at building lifting, and Vader's is building crushing. Yeah, they also mention he can resist the gauntlet and one-shot Hulk, but they don't give us anything to quantify for how impressive those feats are. Not to mention that, if I remember correctly, Thanos has never even been mentioned in any Death Battle episode before this point. And the only time where Hulk has been brought up at the show is when they said he lifted a 150 billion ton mountain, which not only do they still not bring up, but lifting is not as impressive as crushing. With all this in mind, they had every right to have Vader beating Doom. And could you imagine if they actually did that? Low-key, that would make me like this episode even more just for how hilarious it is in hindsight. It's still a bad episode. 42 out of 100. Let's hope that the next episode is better. Wait, this next one is Ben's least favorite episode he's ever worked on? Before we get into the actual episode, I'd like to talk about how this episode was marketed, as well as the quote-unquote death battle curse that plagued the first Goku vs. Superman. The Battle of the Gods movie was announced during the production of the first episode, and although it was released in Japan a couple of months afterwards, it still added a new superform that people thought would change the outcome, but it didn't come into play at all by the final product. As for the marketing, it was supposedly being promoted as a rematch, even though Ben claims that it was meant to be a continuation, not a re-examination. I can understand why he'd want this to be a continuation. Like it or not, Goku vs. Superman was a massive video on YouTube. Never mind a death battle episode, and due to the fact that they've established previous matchups can get a second look, of course people wanted to see a Goku vs. Superman 2. And giving the supposedly misleading marketing, this led the Dragon Ball community to believe that they were gonna let Goku win. And if people cry enough about it, they will start thinking that Death Battle hates a certain character, with their only source of evidence being that they lost their Death Battle episode. This contextualizes the script a lot to me. Just before the episode aired, the script had to be quickly changed to add in the whole, no, Goku is awesome, we love Goku, Superman's just broken as shit. And you see this mentality continue to impact every Dragon Ball episode of the show to this very day. They make Dragon Ball look like peak fiction in comparison to everything else, but if one of those characters lose, then they're all like, no, we love Dragon Ball, don't let this outcome distract you from the fact that we love Dragon Ball a lot! And surprise, poor attempts at coddling the fanboys doesn't actually work. And it's because of all of this that I don't think Death Battle should do any more rematches. They've done 4 of them. One was a tribute to a close friend that helped Death Battle get in the successful position that they're in today, but never changed the outcome. 2 of them actually did change the outcome due to the characters having more in their arsenal to talk about thanks to newer games or changes in how they'd research characters. And then there's Superman vs. Goku. Aside from Mario vs. Sonic, this is the only rematch that exists entirely because of fan demand. And while people would like to see more rematches, given that they've done literally everything they could possibly do with the rematch, every single one of them going forward would either end up being a Mario vs. Sonic, or more egregiously, a Goku vs. Superman. In these entire analyses, I could tell that they secretly just did not want to make this episode. Remember when I mentioned that there were 20 minutes of cut content that had to be removed from Goku vs. Superman 1? That all went into this episode apparently. And it really feels like they're just trying to pad out as much of it as they can, especially with the whole tangent of everything anime being inspired by Journey to the West, as well as the difficulties in how anime was translated over to America. Though to be fair, it does have its pros. I like how they mentioned that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster altered Superman's story based on their personal experiences. But other than that, these really are just two respect threads from characters they already talked about. But hey, at least the animation's good, right? Well, let's find out. The start of this animation does feel like a continuation of Goku vs. Superman 1, with Superman finding the 7 Dragon Balls and summoning Shenron to restore the Earth, which includes Goku, who just randomly calls for a rematch. Oh, and a side note, I feel like Masako X sounded like he was having an off day. The Kamehameha scream is weak, his other screams aren't that good except for the final Kamehameha, and his other line reads aren't read very well. Thankfully, it's just some random guy is able to keep up the same level of quality that his Superman had in the first episode, particularly with Superman's
Neither have you.
But I really don't like the part where he's bragging about his own power. It feels very out of character. And I get it, he's warning Goku that he's this ridiculously powerful individual that he has no chance of beating. But you don't get that impression until Superman starts bringing up that it is his burden to bear, and that Goku should be glad it's not his. In fact, Superman has plenty of other issues in characterization, but this canyon fight is clean! And alive playing during this part? This is great! But it doesn't take away from my biggest problem with this episode. It's not at all conveyed in the context of a fun sparring match. It's not even conveyed as an episode of Death Battle at all. It's conveyed as if they're fighting for the sake of it and it becomes a heated debate. Plus, unlike in the first episode where I mentioned the detail of how he tried to deal as little damage to the city as possible, even leaving it entirely the moment he starts taking the fight seriously, now he's doing more damage to the city than even Goku. Here, Superman has no trouble crashing Goku through buildings or even just outright making them explode. Although I would like to point out that they crashed through the SGC building. During SGC, they had an admittedly really funny moment where they had two cosplayers fighting each other. You can't find this in the episode on Death Battle, but it was live streamed, so thankfully I can show it to you here. But other than that, Superman just not caring about the city and literally taking the fight to the city feels even more out of character. At least Goku's characterization is a little bit better. Okay, never mind, his is just as bad but in completely different ways. But of course, I need to talk about the final scene. Superman walking through the Kamehameha is iconic. It's genuinely a beautiful shot. And I like how the death has a story reason behind it, and Superman's
I'm sorry
is so well delivered. And with how he carries Goku's body in a matter of respect, you know, for all of this faults, I'm glad that it ended on a positive, uplifting note.
I believe this is the part where I say, I told you so.
Okay, I take back everything I said. F the King Kai scene, and f the conclusion repeating these exact words verbatim. Like, why? Oh, and there's also this notorious line.
He is not meant to be relatable. He is not meant to lose.
Other people have pointed out that this is just blatantly disrespecting or at least misunderstanding Superman, and I agree, but there's actually a much worse implication that makes me outright hate this episode way more than I thought I would. You know what this conclusion says to me? It says that this episode doesn't feel like a fight that gives a single shit about the characters. This doesn't feel like Goku versus Superman 2. This feels like an elaborate tribute to the debate of the matchup rather than the characters involved with the matchup itself. And yeah, that is a weird thing to say because Death Battle's supposed to be about the debate, but at least they acknowledge that it's a debate between two characters, not just two functions. Though this does go into the mind-numbingly common criticism that Death Battle doesn't care about the characters, despite the fact that yes, they do. Yeah, their representation is rarely perfect, but they still try to make them look as cool as possible, be it through some fun dialogue, a unique exchange of abilities, smartly woven references to their home series, etc. They even tried to make them look cool in the analyses, Be it covering their backstory in ways that may or may not be interesting, bringing up feats that make them look powerful, or feats from other characters in their series to show that they are just as powerful as them, on top of many other things they could do in the analyses. But this episode, along with Starscream vs. Rainbow Dash and Ragna vs. Soul, feel like the exceptions to the rule. I mean, Goku vs. Superman 2 technically doesn't even have character rundowns. Just some brief histories as to why they exist, not even just what they do in the series, just the fact that they exist. And then they go straight into the history of the debate, which, yeah, it's pretty neat, but why would you not want to cover any cool story beats or developments that they've obviously had in their series, given how long they've been running? Hell, it's even implied that they're using a specific version of Superman. Why would they not try to compare him to other versions of Superman? And that's to say nothing as to the changes in Goku's character. Yeah, there might not be a lot of it, but it should still be enough to bring up in the analysis. And then they tried to put on the whole man who can break any limits versus man with no limits that they had from the first episode, and no, you don't get to do that. The first episode exudes love for the characters and the series they come from, with them literally saying that the analysis is gonna be more in depth than ever before. On top of passionately discussing their backstories and all sorts of endearing compliments and even some lighthearted jabs at both characters. On top of the 10-minute, 29-second animation, which is still longer than every Death Battle episode, period. But the sequel's animation is only 6 minutes and 21 seconds long, which, don't get me wrong, is still a long time by Death Battle standards, but it's not even the 5th longest in this very season. The whole Limits monologue in the first episode, first of all, was technically a monologue, and second of all, was a nice little note to end on top of the abundance of research they've done for this episode, in spite of how flawed it may be by today's standards. But here is just further insinuating the fact that they've made their point and they don't intend to change it, so shut up. I really wasn't expecting to talk about this episode for this long. I was intending on giving it a 50 out of 100, saying, yeah, the disrespect and misunderstanding of Superman is tasteless, but at least Goku was handled pretty well and the animation was great. And while the latter may be true, in the grand scheme of things, the former isn't, so it just accentuates all of these messages. So I'm not gonna sugarcoat this score. 35 out of 100. I'm just disappointed. I mean, this was supposed to be episode 50. Aired at SGC due to fan demand. Yet, truth be told, this was pitiful. Death Battle, stop making me do the YouTuber side challenge. You're gonna have to do a lot more to get me to start liking the show again. Okay. Never mind. Death Battle just casually including yet another one of my all-time favorite characters in fiction. He's next. He's following this notorious episode. Well, I mean, he is one half of my most wanted matchup, but that's not gonna happen because I'm aware that Wario is his most popular opponent, and I really hate that matchup, but I'm willing to accept the fact that it's just gonna happen, and he's not gonna fight my preferred opponent for him. Oh my Lanta. Yeah, this episode is gonna have 2 different timestamps, but can I just talk about how Death Battle just casually announced that they were gonna do my most wanted matchup? Yeah. This is just straight up the most important episode of Death Battle to me. It's not my favorite, don't mistake it for that, but this was a matchup I had wanted Death Battle to do before Death Battle even existed. And the only other matchup to have this much emotional attachment to me is Ragna versus Velvet, which is currently my favorite versus matchup, as well as my new most wanted matchup for Death Battle, period. Donkey Kong and Knuckles? These were my childhood heroes. I'm gonna put those cards on the table. Something about them just always clicked with me. It's kind of embarrassing for me to explain, I get it, but... You ever gotten your most wanted matchup after an episode that you felt kind of on the fence on before eventually discovering that you don't actually like that episode much? That's exactly what this is for me. And now that we're getting into the actual episode itself, I will admit that one of my biggest criticisms is how Death Battle doesn't make this episode sound interesting. The only connections they use are that they guard treasure and it keeps getting stolen and they're not very smart. When there's actually a lot more to the matchup than you would think. Both are the friendly rivals of Mario and Sonic who mostly act adversarial because of their impulsiveness and short tempers, but otherwise they're on good terms with them. Not only are they guardians of an ancient treasure that, yes, does happen to get stolen, but they're known as powerful warriors from an ancient civilization, the Kongs and the Echidnas, who are responsible for guarding an entire island as well as the treasure. They acknowledge it's a lonely lifestyle, but that's appealing to them because they both like to be left alone and just hang around, and maybe jam out with some friends from time to time. They're never against company. While they're not the brightest bulb in the hut, they can be surprisingly intelligent in smaller moments. DK being shockingly good with mechanics, Knuckles having ancient knowledge that even Tails doesn't have, and both having good leadership and strategy skills when the situation calls for it. Another criticism I have is that I'm on the fence as to them excluding their power-ups, and I don't think that Strong Kong alone would counter Hyper Knuckles. I'm only saying this because they mentioned that Mario had to use multiple invincibility power-ups to outlast Supersonic, and DK actually has some unique power-ups of his own, most notably the Crystal Star from DK Jungle Climber, which gives him a rainbow aura that makes him completely invincible, knocking through every enemy in his way, and having unlimited flight for the limited time of its appearance. You know what? Seeing this go against Hyper Knuckles would actually go kinda hard. Why would you not want to have this? Well, I think that they have just enough unique abilities that I guess it's fine. Let's get into the analyses excluding all of this. I really like how DK's analysis starts with the Law of the Jungle poem. The English major in me nuts to that. And they also go over Cranky Kong's history with Jumpman, and they mention his percussionist talents, another nice touch. Though a not so nice touch would be calling his giant punch a signature attack. I get that Smash Bros. Movesets kind of just define characters at this point, but I wouldn't call a generic punch a signature move. Although this bit where they say his name was meant to be translated to be Stupid Ape, that's actually kind of true. I mentioned this before in a video that I know you haven't seen yet for some reason. I would love to go over more, but despite the DK rap having an instrumental version that they should have used in the analysis, they keep using the vocal version. I mean, yeah, they also reference the lyrics, but it would have been way better if they did so in tandem with the lyrics from the DK rap. They also use plenty of clips from the cartoon, which is a mixed bag. It's funny when they're poking fun at the singing and coconut cream pies meme, and Boomstick saying,
"Good one, Brain. I owe you a beer."
And I also like Wiz being weirded out by DK's bald head. But on the other hand, we once again come across the issue of the clips from the cartoon going on for way too long. And it's also used as a means of exaggerating his stupidness and the sole source of pointing out his laziness. Really? Well, let's just move on to Knuckles' analysis. I like how they point out his ancestors and his special bond with the Master Emerald, and the whole bit about echidnas having 4 heads on their penises was okay, but it being used to back up the line,
"Not the sharpest head on the dick, is he?"
I kinda love that. That is low-key brilliant. I wish every sex joke they had could be this clever, but aside from that, this did feel more like a respect thread than DK's did, and they have both versions of Unknown for ME playing with their lyrics. Stop doing that! Also, the napkin bit, I like the joke that comes afterwards, but I don't like how it was meant as a means of pointing out his stupidity when Boom Knuckles is somewhat of a different character, who actually does have his low intelligence as a core theme. Whereas Knuckles in the games and Sonic X as well, at least when he isn't written poorly, is gullible, not stupid. Honestly, anyone who thinks that these characters are dumb as bricks or too stupid to live are unironically much bigger idiots than the people they think are stupid. However, I want to go into this fight real quick.
Yes! Django Django, the best menu music of all time! Woo!
Aside from that, the start is a little rough. Knuckles is eating a banana without peeling it and with no sound effects, and DK is just a little head in this shot and it looks really weird. Not as weird as DK's sprites. I'm not too keen on these sprites and I don't even know where they came from. Honestly, I think I would have preferred a brown colored Hulk. But after that, it starts to pick up. Knuckles dodges DK's attacks with a thumbs up and casually walks out of a cartoon smoke cloud. And you have Knuckles dodging the homing coconuts, but not expecting them to come back, leading to the oh no running gag, which I do think is kind of overplayed, but it's used to a fun degree in this episode. I also like how DK finds openings in Knuckles focusing on dodging the coconuts and Knuckles getting his beatdown interrupted by another coconut. And this part of Knucks getting hit by other coconuts is a bit slow, but it gets saved by him catching one and throwing it back in an excellent animation with great timing. The Japanese oh no, I love it. This next moment I see talked about a lot. Knuckles punches the other coconuts out of the area and runs away so that they can't catch him, and then DK just teleports over to this bush somehow, despite it being explicitly stated that Knuckles is a lot faster than DK. Though, to be fair, I do like how DK is using a bit of strategy here, and that goes into my favorite part of this animation. While the analyses overplay their low intelligence and imply that they lack a strategy, this fight is almost the stark opposite. You see them using strategies and using their abilities in creative ways, and they still come across as aggressive, goofy, and or cocky as you'd expect them to be. Could the characterization be better? Maybe, but personally, I'm very satisfied with the characterization in the fight. Plus, you have Nux using his digging abilities for some stealth attacks and even using his superior speed to get some other hits in. And DK uses his hand slap to try and bury Nux underground, who notices this and rises out of the ground to create a hole to make DK fall into, although one last coconut knocks him into the hole as well. And then we get to the minecart scene, and yep, this is just as good as I remember. Not much happens beyond them looking for a hit while Knuckles is gliding, but it's still a nice change of pace, and I love this shot of DK hugging Knuckles out of fear of the track's ending. I will admit this moment's a little weird, with Knuckles just punching the wall very slowly instead of trying to punch DK to loosen his grip for some reason. I mean, DK tries to do it too, but just randomly stops. But then they do start falling, and the kill is good. Fake out doesn't work, but I like the kill. And the outro clip is one of my favorites. DK finds more bananas for his horde, starting it over, and Knuckles' arms get attacked by one last homing coconut. This joke works because you don't see the coconut immediately. You just see his arms, and the shot is drawn out just long enough to where you wouldn't think you'd see another coconut. And the conclusion? Yeah, it's good. Apparently this moon feat was the one thing that gave DK the win. Or at the very least, another look at Knuckles' moon feat. Given that Donkey Kong actually punches it out of orbit, whereas Knuckles only punches a satellite, that causes an explosion that you can see from Earth, and I guess it would have been nice to see it calced, but I highly doubt it be nearly as strong as Donkey Kong's moon punching feat. So, what score would I give this episode? How about an 88 out of 100? Despite some flawed analyses and ugly DK sprites, I like this episode more than I thought I did. So yeah, thanks Death Battle. You treated this matchup very well, and oh my god, look who's next! Death Battle using yet another one of my favorite characters of all time. Though, I was surprised to see this matchup. This is one of the only matchups that didn't come from any viewer suggestions or requests, as Wolverine's other opponents at the time were Vega, Baraka, and some other people I'm thinking of. But Ben couldn't use those characters because they had nothing to counter Wolverine's insane healing factor. But Torian suggested Raiden, and yeah, it was weird at first, but after watching this episode multiple times, it honestly sold me on this being my favorite for both. Wolverine's analysis, it's pretty good. They covered his story and inner rage in a balanced way, and the brainstem bit has good banter that establishes how Boomstick gets sensitive about being the one who gives all the puns. By the way, I'm kind of interested in ranking every single Boomstick pun. Should I do that? Let me know if I should. But it ends really abruptly for no reason, and his end clip is just really bad. He's barely even on screen. But Raiden's analysis? It's a lot better. They point out how complex Metal Gear lore gets for Raiden in a way that sounds complex, and ends in a bit that's actually functional and decently funny. Cough, cough. And they naturally transition between the vocal and instrumental versions of Rules of Nature. Cough, cough. Compared with the more serious and down-to-earth aspect of Snake's analysis, Raiden's analysis from here on out highlights the more absurd and crazier feats from Metal Gear Rising, which is still his most iconic appearance, as far as I'm aware. And while it does also end abruptly, it at least ends with a line from Boomstick that makes it look like an ending to an analysis. But then we have the fight, and I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, I think this fight is overrated. And it's for one reason and one reason only. The voice acting. It's actually more elaborate than you'd think, because I do think Xander Mobius' Wolverine is great, but the problem isn't with the performance itself, but with it being mixed with way too many clips from Steve Blum's voice clips from Marvel vs. Capcom 3. They've done this sort of thing before and since. But with those episodes, the reason why it took me a long time to notice it was either because there was only one or two clips that barely took precedence in the fight, or it was for a character that didn't have a lot of lines to begin with. Whereas here, Wolverine's got plenty of dialogue, and it's mixed in with not just attack grunts from Steve Blum, but also some full-on dialogue lines as well. To me, it comes across as really distracting because I can't help but notice the very obvious differences between
Xander Mobius' high-pitched Wolverine, which is heavily inspired by the 90s X-Men cartoon,
and
Steve Blum's low-pitched Wolverine, who has a completely different take on the character.
I mean, both of them hurt my throat, but still. And sometimes they'll have them playing back-to-back multiple times. I get it, some corners needed to be cut, but would it really take that much time to ask Xander to go, a few extra times in the booth? Because I'm pretty sure it wouldn't. Although this would have been saved if his opponent's voice acting was just as good, if not better. But sadly, I'm not too keen on Tim Page's Raiden. Low-key, Xander Mobius' Wolverine is a better Raiden than Tim Page's. He does get some good deliveries here and there, but a lot of his lines just don't do it for me. With that being said, I still like this episode a lot. I mean, I guess I could say that Raiden's ninja run parkour look a little janky, and I do think this landing has a little too much impact, but other than that, everything about this animation is amazing. I like the part where Raiden takes the core from a dead robot to restore his energy. That's a nice reference that also made the dynamic more interesting, because it gives him something to play off of Wolverine's infamous healing factor. And Wolverine gets plenty of great moments in choreography, from the badass ones like using his experience and senses to bypass Raiden's stealth, to the sillier ones, like Wolverine just climbing up the wall with his claws.
What?
Wolverine's nicknames for Raiden also play around in character, and the strongest metal around exchange has some wonky dialogue, but the swing harder line was alright. But then Raiden loses his arm and says,
Not again!
That's perfect. That is so perfect. And then the ending where you see Berserker Rage versus Jack the Ripper, everything here just goes hard, and it leads to yet another fantastic one-stroke duel where it's used as an opening for the death rather than it being the death itself. And the way that Raiden is using practically everything he's got to kill Wolverine, this was during a time where people thought Wolverine was unkillable. I mean, that healing factor really is crazy. And last thing about Wolverine versus Raiden, EXO is a phenomenal original track. It genuinely feels like a song you'd hear in Metal Gear Rising, while also having lyrics that fit the theme of the matchup. It's awesome. And as for the aftermath, the after clip is Raiden picking up his arm and reattaching it. Okay, fair. But the conclusion? This is what really sold me on the matchup. Never mind the analyses giving off some fairly similar backstories, as well as them having berserker forms, but the entire conclusion is based around the high-frequency blade and how it can cut through Wolverine's adamantium skeleton. And yet it still implies that Wolverine could win if he was faster or stronger. He's not, but I like how it's still there. Overall, despite the issues with the voice acting and the poor use of MVC3 clips, I still love this episode. 86 out of 100. This is a special episode. You know you're in for one when the intro starts with the words of Bruce Lee and Hercules and Dan's intro clips having them falling on the ground. Remember when I said Tony versus Lex's analysis did go on for a little too long according to Ben? It was this episode where he realized that the rundowns of both characters should be no longer than 5 pages in a script. While I did still enjoy Tony and Lex's analyses, I think that's fair. And they definitely paid off in this episode. Learning about Hercule's story in particular was still great. I know way too many people in this world named Mark. They go back and forth on whether they want to be nice or mean to him, but that's fine. And Boomstick does say this.
At least he's not Yamcha.
It's only a matter of time before Yamcha gets on Death Battle. But they do talk about his redeeming qualities, such as his love for his daughter, as well as just how he's a generally great guy. This analysis alone made Hercule one of my favorite Dragon Ball characters ever. Sure, I may not like Dragon Ball, so you can interpret that however you want to, but don't you just love it when Death Battle makes you have a massive respect for something you otherwise don't like or don't care about? I love to see it, at least. And as for Dan's analysis, it starts off by mentioning how he was made in response to SNK blatantly ripping off Capcom's characters. Wait, rumored descendant of Donovan Bane? What? They also show Sakura calling him a slur. Lol. I do kind of wish that they went into detail about how bad his martial arts style is. I mean, obviously the key attacks and special moves suck and you don't need to really go into detail on why, but it would have been funny to mention how they're worse or how they lack the same properties of Ryu and Ken's moves. This is not a criticism though. But I think my favorite part of this analysis are the visual gags. Dan teabagging after a super taunt and his actual super whiffing aside from one hit. Unlike with every other Street Fighter analysis where they have their attacks connecting properly, I love this attention to detail. And Dan's end clip is perfect, where it's literally him getting KO'd after whiffing a DP. You love to see it. And with analyses that are this much fun, one would reasonably assume that the fight would be just as fun, if not more so, right? Well, yep, it's still just as amazing as I remember. I really like Kagi's Hercule. It's almost a spot-on impression of Chris Rager's, nailing his ego, his stage presence, and the way he talks to the crowd. And Brad Venable really is one of the best voice actors that Death Battle's ever used. His Otacon is great, but I think his Dan is even better. And I also love the setting of this fight, especially with nobody rooting for Dan. And one of the best parts of the animation is how their first attacks have Season 7 tier sound design combined with the pom-pom theme. This is comedy gold! And the announcer is just passive-aggressive at a few points, still praising Hercule, but also having lines like this.
The secret to countering such an attack was to act like a coward!
And then doing a complete 180 the moment the death happens, which we'll get to in a bit. And the whole jetpack scene...
Well, that's disappointing.
is great. Better than the next scene, which you say there's only one capsule left. What would you call these then? Oh, but the Raging Demon scene. Oh, this scene is sadly not as good as I remember. I could tell that they were trying to hide the fact that the effect was cutting off, and the lines Dan has are mostly carried by the effects on his voice in my opinion. Though I do like how it fails by Dan tripping over the jetpack. But this ending is fantastic. Hercule gets a banger line, a badass final beatdown, and gets a completely brutal death with... Oh, man. Okay, you know what? This is the best possible death the episode could have. And the outro clip is another one of my favorites. Hercule dancing to his own victory, and Dan cries in front of his dead dad, who's completely disappointed. And the conclusion is good, showing more respect for Hercule than Dan, but I mean that in the best way. I guess if I had to say one criticism, it'd be that they don't bring up Dan's Raging Demon tripping over Sakura's backpack until this conclusion, which wouldn't be a big deal if the Raging Demon scene wasn't supposed to be a direct reference to it. But, oh well, this is still a fantastic episode. 91 out of 100. It seems like Death Battle has finally found its footing and quality. Let's keep this up! Yeah, I'm not gonna sugarcoat this. Rooster Teeth having as much pull as they did for this episode was one of the best things that happened to Death Battle, period. I say this because it represents an imperative change in Death Battle, its growing relationship with Rooster Teeth, which would allow Death Battle to get more staff to create higher quality episodes, have the schedule be far more consistent, and a few other caveats that we'll get to throughout this series. Although they never merged with Rooster Teeth officially until the start of Season 6, this episode was the start of a solid relationship with them. Monty had helped them get connections with many of the staff at Rooster Teeth, who let Death Battle not only use a Ruby character, but also let them hire her official voice actress, use Yang's theme in the fight, and even use the same model from Ruby. But there is still one bad thing that a lot of people remember with this episode, but we'll get there when we get there. When revisiting this episode, I was under the impression that they were just gonna do a lot of sucking off to Ruby, but Yang's analysis didn't bother me that much. I mean, they do give Ruby a lot of praise, but it doesn't feel like they're sucking off to it. Especially under the context of this show having a mostly niche following and Death Battle wanting to give it some time in the spotlight. I think this feels less like, watch our show! And more like, hey, here's this really cool show that we like, you should check it out. It's more casual, it's more respectful. And Boomstick loving the setting of Ruby feels in character for him. Although the sound effect is really not that cool, I'm sorry, it's just a basic shotgun sound effect. What are you talking about, bruv? Apparently this analysis is also kind of outdated, much like other aspects of this episode, but we'll get there. Because some of the stuff they say was either not confirmed until later in the series, where they have it be proven wrong in later volumes, or were just never true in the first place. So yeah, Yang's rundown wasn't that bad, but Tifa sucks. The constant references to Tifa's chest feel so forced. Look, it's one thing for horny Boomstick to come into play, but for Wiz to always assume that he's talking about it, and for Boomstick to just tease him over it at every given moment, even if it's unwarranted, that's not fun. And aside from that, everything else about it is just a respect thread. I sleep. That is until her end clip. Why do I hear Onion Knight scream when seeing Tidus's portrait? I'm pretty sure this isn't a bug in Dissidia itself, so I'm pretty sure Death Battle done goofed. But now on to the fight, and let's get to the thing that you really want me to talk about. This fight looks hideous! Neither model has a consistent look to them, and every single time they change appearance, they still clash with one another. Oh, and side note, you probably didn't notice this at first, but Tifa never changes the expression on her face. I mean, you have Yang smiling, frowning, looking surprised, but none of that's for Tifa, because apparently she's not allowed to have a good-looking model. I mean, Yang's also keeps bugging out, but I hear that's in character for Ruby, so I'll ignore it. Plus, the fight does have some good choreography and animations. I mean, it's a Torian episode, so go figure. I like the Advent Children reference and a few of the limit breaks, but aside from that, there are plenty of other issues. Like, for starters, I'm not particularly thrilled with the characterization of these characters. People often criticize Yang just beating up this bouncer for no reason. But something that I'm trying to understand is that Yang notices a strand of her hair falling off, and if I remember correctly, she gets livid when her hair gets damaged or destroyed, even if it's just a tiny bit. Yet, even though she's giving this massive beatdown on Tifa, she's still smiling and maintaining her supposedly tomboyish attitude and demeanor. Is it in character for Yang to just look happy while she's angry? At least in the context of her losing a strand of her hair. If you would argue that it is, I don't think it's controversial to say Tifa's characterization is far worse. Like, there's this one part where she says, "Don't mock me!" For some reason, like, Yang wasn't mocking you. And on top of that, her voice sounds too young and bratty for my liking. Say what you want about how she sounded in Advent Children, but I think that voice clears this one. Tia Ballard gives off a good performance. I'm not trying to downplay her at all. I just think she was kind of miscast. And then it's followed by the death, and let's talk about it. The animation is weird. It's hiding the fact that Tifa is incapable of closing her eyes a single time, but that's not what you want me to talk about. You want me to talk about this banner right here. Okay, I get why there's an advertisement at all. Rooster Teeth wanted them to advertise it at some point in the fight. Fair enough. But what if I told you that this was going to be far different? In fact, I'm just gonna read the exact words that Ben used in his Road to 100 blog. The original plan was that Yang's killing blow was supposed to happen near a stack of leaflets advertising the Volatile Festival. The leaflets were supposed to get kicked up by the Force, blowing around the arena, until one of them smacked into the camera, revealing its printed ad. Ben, that is so much worse! That is actually way worse! Why is that your single disappointment? Dude! But you know what's sad? They could have put this advertisement literally anywhere else in the fight. They could have put this at the beginning of this episode on the door that entered the bar. Or maybe the whole leaflets thing could have happened during this Advent Children reference. I fail to see why you wouldn't be disappointed by the advertisement showing up as Tifa dies. Oh, and the conclusion? Enough with the vocal tracks playing during moments when you're talking! Yeah, it's the worst conclusion of any episode, and it's not even close. I don't think anyone in the history of ever is able to defend Yang getting a no-limits fallacy that she doesn't actually have according to the show. Although, in the show's defense, I did hear that the semblance's limits weren't fully defined until after this episode, but at the same time, it's still a no-limits fallacy. And it's one with even less justification than Ganondorf. But for those of you who would like to see Yang versus Tifa again, well, here's what Ben has to say in the context of them doing a potential season of remasters.
I don't think we'll ever do a rematch of Tifa versus Yang. There are plenty of episodes, especially from season 1 and 2 of Death Battle, that I think would be pretty easy for us to maybe disagree with. So I think it's safe to say, pretty sure that one would change.
There, they admit they done goofed this episode. Yeah, Tifa run back when because 37 out of 100. Yes, I'm giving it a higher score than Goku versus Superman 2. What of it?
Who was a tougher opponent for you to fight, Yang? Mercury Black or Tifa Lockhart?
Oh, well, spoiler alert, one of them's dead.
How dare you? Yang, no!
Before we talk about Mega Man vs. Astro Boy, I would like to go over the way that it was announced. It was announced through the season finale of a Screw Attack original show called The Industry. I get what they were trying to do here. They wanted Death Battle fans to check out some of their other shows, because Death Battle was just that much more popular than the entirety of Screw Attack's library combined. But I think you should have saved this for a season premiere or even for a new series. Not the season finale where they would have no context as to what the series is even like. Though Torian has some sick ballet moves, I'll admit. But let's not dwell about this for too long, because I want to talk about this matchup. Originally, I was skeptical, but then I looked into it, and this is another inspiration versus original matchup. Yang vs. Tifa was one of those as well, albeit to a much more egregious degree. That's kind of a fun thing to say, egregious degree. This episode has two more of my favorite rundowns in the entire show. Hearing about Mega Man's story was presented very well with the background music, having a very engaging start, having some good jokes such as Iceman being cold, and this line from Boomstick.
Explosive, which sticks to walls and enemies faster than the girl who said she loves you on the first date.
The fine-tunings of his weapons were interesting, all leading up to an end clip that is actually pretty bad, not gonna lie, Wiz. And Astro Boy's is even better. It's well paced, it has other good jokes, and its emotional beats made me care about Astro Boy. I still have yet to check out some of his original series, as the most I knew about him was that movie everyone forgot about. But I do have interest, and this analysis made me care. This is because of Boomstick's delivery of moments like Tobio's death and Tenma sending Astro Boy to the circus subtly build up emotion from the viewer, and then he just casually shoots it down almost immediately, making you feel bad for these tragic situations. And then there's a bit where they freak out over how Astro Boy gets recharged. While I do like Boomstick's reaction and Wiz desperately trying to defend it, it doesn't change the fact that it's still weird to look at. And then the fight starts with a Mega Man 2 reference. Go figure. Ben was trying to figure out which were the best weapons to use for the fight, and I'd say he did choose the right ones. It starts off with Rock's pea shooter barrage, which is giving me some Boba Fett vs. Samus 1 vibes, but to be fair, it is done better because it does have good sound design, and it at least pushes Astro back for some impact. He also uses his homing weapons like the dive missile, magnet missile, and hornet chaser. These were obvious picks since they could help him keep up with Astro's flight. And the way he utilizes the second magnet missile is interesting. One gets destroyed, but the other one still follows Astro, making it even harder for Astro to get a good opening on him. And then Rock does this hard knuckle, which feels very heavy. And then we get to an aspect of the episode that I think tends to get overlooked. The facial expressions, despite how simple they are really well done. There's Rock's reaction to the funny butt cannons, as well as Astro just lifting a car, and even Astro's facial expression after he gets incinerated by the atomic fire. And then Rock starts shooting metal blades, and it runs out of ammo. Okay, of all weapons, why is this the only one that actually runs out? I mean, I guess you could count the flash stopper, but counterpoint, that scene is great. It's led up to with the black hole bomb and the crash bomb combo working against him, with Astro looking like he has to use all of his thrusters and fully power them just to escape it. And although this punch does look kinda limp, in his defense, it is the best he could work with. And then Rock being pinned by his metal blade with another fantastic expression, just barely activating the flash stopper, completely cutting off the music and sound effects, making it feel like Rock was using it by the skin of his teeth. And the way he just slowly walks away, it's a nice little break from the fight after all that suspense. But once time starts moving again, things get a little weird. The super adapter transformation is fine, but once they start flying in the air, it keeps cutting to this shot of a star rising, which yes, is supposed to be them, but did it really need to be shown 3 different times before an explosion? Which, to be fair, despite a basic design, it does have a ton of impact in the final explosion, leading to a pretty good death. Though another thing I'd like to point out is that in this shot, Mega Man is using 2 Mega Busters instead of 1. And I would like to mention that in the analysis, they said that doing this could potentially kill him. And given that Astro Boy literally tore off his super adapter armor, it's easy to interpret this as Mega Man literally using a last resort. I really like this touch. And it's further proof that people should stop sleeping on the analyses for no reason. And I love the outro clip where Astro is playing fetch with Rush, using Rock's remains. And Rush is just okay with the fact that his master's dead. Pretty underrated episode. 87 out of 100. If it's been a while since you've seen it, give it another watch. Oh, hi Bullseye. Sometimes I feel like I'm the only person that really likes both of these characters, so that means I did click with these analyses. Oliver is the GOAT, by the way. You have things like the chili reference, the characters as trick arrows were interesting to learn about. I like Boomstick's delivery of,
Hate it when that happens.
and then the chimney sweep arrows. I like how it's written there. Oliver's end clip is weird, but that arrow shot gives me nostalgic chills, not gonna lie. In Hawkeye's analysis, you know you're in for something great when his weight is displayed twice. And there's also pretty funny build-up to a Nick Kramer cameo. It's funnier when you realize that he's the one who wrote this episode, and then you take this as a reference to the dark period of this season. But the rest of Hawkeye's analysis is fun. Most notably when they brought up how he was able to impress Iron Fist. But as for the fight, this whole animation was fighting an uphill battle. This was the final episode animated by Zach Watkins before working on 1 Minute Melee and eventually returning partway through season 4. Since 1 Minute Melee randomly went MIA. And the very nature of this matchup means that they would have to seriously rely on their trick arrows to make it look remotely interesting. So let's see how they did that. Ooh, Sly Cooper music? I like that. And the dialogue consists entirely of their Injustice and MVC3 voice clips respectively, and it's hit or miss. Sometimes it's natural, sometimes it's not, and sometimes Clint is magically able to hear Oliver from a full building away. But we do get an intriguing interaction with Oliver responding to Clint's pin particle arrow barrage with a tornado arrow. On the one hand, that was cool, but on the other hand, they were clearly about to hit Oliver, but suddenly the tornado arrow just moved them all back to the center, What, did his building get pushed further away or something? It's also kind of weird how Clint didn't try to dodge any of the arrows. I mean, I like this moment where Oliver is using an acid arrow to melt the putty off of his face. And the next scene is even better, with Oliver using a boomerang arrow to distract Clint so that he can get a hit with a boxing glove arrow, leading to a funny fail moment. You can even see Oliver pulling out his phone, which makes sense when you remember that they used the line where he should make it his ringtone. And this is where we get to the original track of the episode, You Have Failed This City by Brandon Yates. Personally, I think this track is really underrated, but they only used the instrumental version the whole time. And I think it had something to do with Brandon not liking the way he did the vocals. I think the vocals are pretty cool. It's a nice AC/DC reference if nothing else. Then it leads to the CQC bit, which is alright, though Oliver's beatdown does look pretty weird. And then they attempt a one-stroke duel for some reason, even though we already knew that Clint's arrow pierced him. And then the outro clip is Black Canary materializing next to Clint as he hits Oliver with another pin particle arrow, and he's taken by a bug. Yeah, as much as I wanted to like this episode and say it was also underrated, it kinda let me down. It was a difficult episode to make as interesting as possible, but I feel like they should have used more trick arrows. Where were the ice arrows, or the buzzsaw arrows, or dare I say, the chimney sweep arrows? I feel like you could have had some fun interactions with all of those. Oh well, at least the conclusion makes sense. And it's both fitting and ironic how, in a season that feels like a mixed bag, this is one of 3 episodes that I actually feel mixed on. 57 out of 100. Peculiar score, but let's see how this season ends. I am not calling this episode Pokemon vs. Digimon. I mean, I understand why it was called that, because for one, Ben couldn't make this a 6v6 episode, and 2, they still couldn't wrap their heads around how to make this episode work. Thankfully, Gen 6 came along and introduced Mega Evolutions, which Charizard had too. And for 3, he said that this episode went from being Charizard versus Agumon, or something like Red versus Tai, to Pokemon versus Digimon for SEO reasons. And I think it paid off pretty well. 13 million views is nothing to scoff at. Then again, he also says that Charizard and Agumon were the best choices to represent this matchup. And while I do see where he's coming from, I do have a couple of questions, if not outright disagreements with it, but we'll get there when we get there. The analyses, they're alright. For Charizard being the only character to come back within the same season, even if it technically has been a year since his previous episode, they covered quite a few interesting tidbits, and they brought back the thing about his tail, but also brought up how water can't extinguish it, at least not by itself. And they also had plenty of new things to talk about with his Mega Evolution, and they also talked about Red quite a bit. I think it was covered pretty well. Kinda wish his end clip was a clip from the anime, but what can you do? But Agumon's analysis is a little weird to me. Tai's bond with Agumon gave me some Felicia versus Tao Kaka vibes and how they skim over and how their bond grew for evolution, talk about Agumon's multiple Digivolutions, and then back to how their bond grew. Although, while Felicia vs. Tao Kaga was a season 1 episode where I can excuse it a little more, it stands out to me even more here. But there are some moments like how Boomstick pokes fun at Edamon's existence, but I'm not too keen on Boomstick saying that the writers were on drugs. And he says this twice, for some reason. I get that he's at least poking fun at the actually crazy stuff, but the second one for the diplomats thing is just unnecessary, and also kinda rude. The end clip is also split in half as well. First half plays when they talk about Tai learning humility, and the second half plays after Boomstick says that they became diplomats. It's weird, but you know what's even weirder? This fight. No need to sugarcoat how unpolished it is, because you can see this episode coded in black bars, glitching backgrounds, and reused animations. Look, you can add speed lines or zoom in the camera all you want, but that doesn't change the fact that I can still see you using the same clip of Red 4 different times. And Zard's Mega Evolution is sadly not as impressive as I remember as being. I mean, it's definitely not bad, but given the amazing buildup of Charizard fainting in the water, and then Red going, "I believe in Charizard!" I would prefer some extra effects than Charizard moving up. Not to mention, War Greymon's transformation is straight up unfinished. Why does the model practically look unanimated during the transformation? More people have started to dislike this episode because of its flaws. But I'm not one of them. I still like this episode. One reason is because I think the setup is fun. Tai and Agumon do have a motive for fighting Red and Zard, but Red is still the one to start the fight because, well, of course. And while I don't really care for Mega Charizard or War Greymon's evolutions, Greymon's Digivolution looks really good. It even has the Digimon theme playing. And then you have Red throwing the Pokeball at Greymon. Okay, I'll be honest, I actually had to pause the video because I was laughing so hard. This had me rolling. And also, while plenty of visuals in this episode don't look good, I will say that this beam struggle with their fire breaths looks amazing. It's even better than Charizard's beam struggle with Venusaur. Like, wow. And as far as fight choreography, Red uses some pretty good strategy. It creates an interesting dynamic where Red has to rely on all this strategy, whereas Agumon / Greymon / War Greymon doesn't have to worry about directions from Tai, barring the moments where Tai needs to give some emotional support, even if it means he has to say "okay, buddy" twice with the exact same voice clip. But I wouldn't mind reused voice clips because these are some great performances. Nate Wants to Battle does a great job as Red, Todd Habercorn sells me on Tai, and my favorite performance of this episode, Xander Mobus's Agumon. I fucking love it. Nate also created an original track for this matchup, and it's also good. Not as memorable as Alive, EXO, or even You Have Failed This City, but I still like it. It's a great track that fits the fight. And then the death. Okay, Ben joked about Red and Zard having a brutal death, but decided against it since he wanted to avoid the flack he got from the TMNT Battle Royale. So he pitched a more tame death that didn't show Red getting disintegrated. And Torian just straight up ignored it! But then we get to the conclusion, and I like how it has that thematic edge throughout pretty much the entire conclusion. But there is one moment I wanted to point out. Remember when I disagreed with Charizard versus Agumon being the best matchup to represent Pokemon versus Digimon? This line right here is why.
And War Greymon has weapons specifically designed to kill dragons.
Am I able to say a better matchup than Charizard versus Agumon? I couldn't tell you, but this line here makes me think that there's probably something out there. Either way, I think this is a heavily flawed episode that definitely has a lot of love to it. I feel like I would have gotten more out of this episode if I liked Pokemon and had more than 0% interest in Digimon, but then again, I gave the Pokemon Battle Royale an extremely high score despite disliking Pokemon. But I guess the flaws in that episode were far easier for me to ignore, but that doesn't mean I'm gonna sleep on this episode. 77 out of 100. Despite a volatile season, I'm happy to say that it ended off on a fairly positive note. Man, that was some ride, wasn't it? Anyways, here's my ranking of the season. At first glance, you look at the top and assume that this was a fantastic season, which I'd say it is, but then you look a little further down and see how many awful episodes came from this season. And I honestly wasn't expecting so many awful episodes. With season 1, I mostly knew how I'd feel about each episode with only a couple of surprises, but even then, it's not like I debated their placements or anything. But with this season, the expectations were all over the place. There were some episodes I liked more on rewatch, some I liked less on rewatch, some I had more respect for but still don't like, and some that aren't as good as I remember, but I still like them. Well, I think we should go back to that Monty quote. Growth is awkward. In retrospect, kind of embarrassing. Hardly appreciating how important they were, but in the end, ultimately necessary. When we start to add season 1 to this ranking, yeah, I can definitely see how that growth was ultimately necessary. Also, I was right to say that most season 1 episodes would be dropped by a full tier. This quote also represents season 2's rough production, with Chuck Norris versus Segata Sanshiro giving them a chance to work with a more consistent schedule, funnily enough. And I think it paved the way for a brighter future of Death Battle, with season 3 being the first season to fully maintain an annual schedule, safely delivering 16 episodes per season as opposed to however long they felt like. One would think that it would be the turning point where Death Battle would maintain a consistent quality and start pushing out banger after banger after banger now that they have a consistent amount of time to work with. Well, we'll just have to get to that season next time, but only if